The train's whistle cut through the afternoon heat like a scream. Clara Whitmore pressed her palm against the window, watching Silver Ridge materialize through clouds of dust and steam. The town looked exactly like the letters had described, a collection of wooden buildings clinging to existence in a valley that seemed determined to shake them loose. Mountains rose in the distance, jagged and indifferent. The sky stretched wide enough to swallow hope whole. She smoothed her dress for the 100th time. Navy cotton, carefully mended at the sleeves. The best she owned. Her fingers trembled as she checked the cameo at her throat. Her mother's, the only valuable thing she'd brought besides the $12 sewn into her hem. "Silver Ridge!" the conductor bellowed. 10 minutes stop! Clara stood, gripping her suitcase with both hands. Inside, 2 dresses, undergarments, a book of poetry, and the bundle of letters that had convinced her to cross half a continent to marry a man whose face she'd never seen. Thomas Wardell, age 34, owns a mercantile. Seeking a practical woman of good character for marriage and partnership. Practical. That was the word that had hooked her. Not beautiful, not charming, not young. Practical. She'd answered honestly, told him about her father's death, the debts, her mother's failing health, her 2 younger sisters who needed feeding. She'd written about her skills, cooking, sewing, bookkeeping, gardening. She hadn't lied about her age or her appearance, though she'd been careful with her words. His response had been encouraging, direct. He'd sent money for the ticket, and now here she was, about to meet the man who would become her husband by week's end. The platform was crowded with people. Ranch hands collecting supplies, women in faded calico, children darting between crates. Clara scanned the faces looking for someone who might be looking for her. She saw him immediately. Not because he was searching for her, but because he was staring. The man stood near the station house, arms crossed, expression carved from stone. Tall, lean, maybe 40, dark hair going gray at the temples. He wore a clean shirt and a vest, merchant's clothes, and he was watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Thomas Wardell, had to be. Clara lifted her hand in a tentative wave. He didn't move, didn't smile, just kept staring. Then he turned and walked away. Clara's hand dropped. Confusion crashed over her, followed quickly by something colder. She grabbed her suitcase and hurried down the steps, nearly tripping over her skirt. "Mr. Wardell!" she called. "Mr. Wardell, wait!" He was already disappearing around the corner of the building. Clara pushed through the crowd, her heart hammering. She rounded the corner and stopped short. He was standing there, talking to a boy of maybe 12. Money changed hands. The boy glanced at Clara, then back at the man, his expression caught between confusion and pity. Thomas Wardell looked at her once more, a single dismissive sweep of his eyes, then walked away in the opposite direction. The boy approached slowly, holding out a folded piece of paper. "He said to give you this, ma'am." Clara took it. Her fingers felt numb. The boy hesitated. He said there's a boarding house on Main Street, Mrs. Kellen's place. She might have a room." Then he was gone too, running off before she could form words. Clara unfolded the paper. The handwriting was neat, businesslike. "Miss Whitmore, after seeing you in person, I have reconsidered our arrangement. You appear to be exactly as you described yourself, which is unfortunately not what I require. I need a wife who will enhance my standing in this community, not merely maintain it. Additionally, your manner of dress and bearing suggest a woman of strong opinions, which would not suit my household. I have enclosed funds sufficient for your return journey. I trust you will make arrangements promptly. The train departs eastbound at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. I apologize for any inconvenience. Thomas Wardell." Tucked inside the note were $3. Clara stood there, the paper shaking in her hands, while the world tilted sideways. She read it again, then again, too opinionated. He'd looked at her for 30 seconds and decided she had too many opinions. She wanted to laugh. She wanted to scream. Instead, she just stood there, frozen, while people moved around her like water around a stone. The train whistle blew again. Departure warning. Clara's mind raced through calculations with the speed of panic. $12 in her hem, 3 in her hand. The ticket back east would cost at least 10, maybe 12, depending on the route. That left her with almost nothing. Not enough to help her family. Not enough to... The whistle screamed one last time. Then the train was moving, pulling away from the platform, carrying with it any chance of retreat. Clara watched it go. She'd meant to get back on, meant to stuff her pride down deep and use Wardell's money to slink home in defeat. But her feet hadn't moved. Her body had refused the command, and now it was too late. The platform emptied. The dust settled. And Clara Whitmore stood alone in Silver Ridge with $15, a suitcase, and absolutely no idea what to do next. She made herself walk. One foot, then the other. Back around the station house, onto the main street. The town looked different now, harder. Every building seemed to lean away from her. Every face that turned her direction held the same question. What are you doing here? Clara found the boarding house on the 3rd block. A 2-story structure with peeling paint and a crooked sign. She climbed the steps and knocked. The woman who answered was somewhere past 60, with suspicious eyes and flour on her hands. Mrs. Kellen? Depends on who's asking. Clara Whitmore. I was told you might have a room available. The woman looked her over. You got money? Yes. How much? Clara hesitated. How much is the room? $2 a week. Meals included. Pay in advance. $2. That was manageable. For a few weeks at least, while she figured out. But I don't take single women, Mrs. Kellen added flatly. Too much trouble. Clara's stomach dropped. I'm not trouble. I just need. Don't matter what you need. I run a respectable house. Single women bring the wrong kind of attention. Men get ideas. Other boarders complain. It's more headache than it's worth. Please. The word came out smaller than Clara intended. I only just arrived. I have nowhere else. Try the saloon. Mrs. Kellen started to close the door. They take all kinds. The door shut in her face. Clara stood there, staring at the wood. The saloon. She knew what that meant, what kind of work they'd offer her there. She descended the steps carefully, precisely, as if the world might shatter if she moved too fast. At the bottom, she paused to collect herself. Think. She needed to think. She could try the other buildings. Ask about work. Maybe someone needed. What? What did this town need that she could provide? She had no references, no connections, no husband to vouch for her respectability. A practical woman. That's what she'd called herself in the letters. Well, time to be practical. Clara started walking, checking each storefront. The Mercantile, Wardell's she realized with a sick twist, was locked up tight. The dry goods store had a sign in the window. No help wanted. The restaurant looked promising until she saw the waitress inside. Young, pretty, blonde. Everything Clara wasn't. An hour passed. Then 2. The sun dropped lower, painting the mountains gold and the valley shadows long. Clara's feet ached. Her throat was dry. She'd walked every street, knocked on every door that looked even remotely welcoming. Nothing. She ended up back near the station, sitting on a bench with her suitcase, trying to make herself invisible while her mind spun through increasingly desperate options. She could sleep outside tonight, save the money. In the morning, she'd. You look lost. Clara's head snapped up. The man standing in front of her wasn't like the others she'd seen today. Rough clothes, work-worn hands, a face that had spent years in the sun. He wasn't old, maybe 35, but he carried himself like someone who'd learned hard lessons and remembered them all. I'm fine, Clara said automatically. You're sitting on a bench at sundown with a suitcase and no place to go. That's not fine. She studied him warily. Dark eyes, serious mouth, a scar along his jawline that pulled slightly when he spoke. He didn't look threatening exactly, but he didn't look safe either. I'm waiting for someone, she lied. Who? When she didn't answer, he nodded slowly. Thought so. He glanced around the empty street, then back at her. You're the woman Wardell was supposed to marry. It wasn't a question. Clara's face burned. News travels fast. It's a small town, and Wardell's got a big mouth when he's been drinking. The man's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Said he ordered a wife from back east, and she showed up looking like a schoolteacher with opinions. Clara stood abruptly. If you came here to... I came here because I saw you walking in circles for 2 hours and figured you might need help. I don't need anything from anyone. That's so. He tilted his head. Where are you staying tonight? She didn't answer. That's what I thought. He was quiet for a moment. I'm Ethan Calloway. I run a ranch about 8 miles north of here, Redstone. Clara said nothing. I need a housekeeper. he continued. "The place is falling apart. I can't cook worth a damn, and the last person I hired quit after a week because the work was too hard and the isolation drove her crazy. I'm not interested. I'm offering fair wages, room and board included, separate quarters. And before you ask, no, I'm not looking for anything beyond housekeeping." Clara laughed, sharp and bitter. "You don't even know me. I know you're stuck. I know you're trying not to show it. And I know you're practical enough to cross a continent to marry a stranger, which means you can make hard choices when you need to." He paused. "I'm offering you one now." "Why?" The question burst out of her. "Why would you help me?" Ethan Calloway was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was different, careful. "Because I watched Thomas Wardell look at you like you were livestock he'd decided not to buy. And because I've been on the wrong end of that kind of judgment before." He met her eyes. "You deserve better than sleeping in an alley tonight." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to throw his pity back in his face. But the sun was almost gone and she was so tired and she had nowhere else to go. "Just housekeeping?" she asked quietly. "Just housekeeping." "Separate quarters?" "Yes." She looked at him for a long time, trying to read the truth in his face. He didn't look away. Finally, Clara nodded once. "All right." "All right." He picked up her suitcase before she could protest. "Wagon's this way." They walked in silence to a buckboard wagon hitched outside the feed store. Ethan loaded her suitcase into the back, then offered his hand to help her up. Clara hesitated, then took it. His grip was solid, calloused. He let go as soon as she was seated. They left Silver Ridge as the last light bled from the sky. Clara didn't look back. The ranch appeared out of the darkness like something from a ghost story. A single-story house, low and sprawling, with a porch that sagged on one end. Barn and outbuildings barely visible in the moonlight. Fences that needed mending. Land that stretched away into nothing. Ethan pulled the wagon to a stop and sat there for a moment, looking at the house. "It's not much," he said finally. Clara climbed down without waiting for help. "Where's the housekeeper's quarters?" "Around back. I'll show you." He led her past the main house to a smaller structure, barely more than a shed, really. But it had 4 walls and a door that latched. Inside was a narrow bed, a washstand, a single chair, and a small stove. "I'll get it warmed up," Ethan said. "Takes the chill off at night. It's fine. You'll need—" "I said it's fine." Clara set her suitcase on the bed and turned to face him. "What are my duties?" Ethan looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "Cooking, cleaning, laundry. There's chickens that need feeding, garden needs work. I'll handle everything outside the house." "Wages?" $10 a month, plus room and board." It was less than she'd hoped for, but more than she'd expected. "When do I start?" "Tomorrow's soon enough. You should—" "I'll start now." Clara removed her hat, set it carefully on the chair. "What needs doing first?" "It's late. You should rest." "Mr. Calloway." He met his eyes. "I would prefer to work, if that's acceptable." Something shifted in his expression. Understanding, maybe. Or recognition of a fellow creature who couldn't sit still with their thoughts. "Kitchen's a mess," he said quietly. "If you wanted to start there." "Show me." The main house was worse than she'd expected. Dishes stacked in the basin, counter covered in crumbs and spills, floor that hadn't seen a broom in weeks. The whole place had the particular staleness of a home where no one cared enough to open windows. Clara stood in the doorway, taking it in. "Like I said," Ethan offered, "it's not much." "Where do you keep the cleaning supplies?" He showed her a cabinet, mostly empty. A few rags, some lye soap, a broom with half its bristles gone. "I'll make a list," Clara said. "Tomorrow I'll need supplies from town." "I'll take you. Just give me money. I can walk." "It's 8 miles." "I'm aware." Ethan was quiet. Then, "The list can wait. Tonight just do what you can with what's here." He left her alone. Clara rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She started with the dishes, heating water on the stove, scrubbing each plate and cup and fork until her hands were raw. Then the counter, the table, the stove itself. The floor took an hour, working section by section on her hands and knees. Somewhere around midnight, she realized Ethan had left a lamp burning in the window of his room. Not bright, just enough to show he was still awake, watching over her maybe, or just unable to sleep himself. Clara didn't stop until the kitchen was clean. When she finally returned to her quarters, exhausted and aching, she found a blanket draped over her bed that hadn't been there before, and on the washstand a pitcher of fresh water and a clean towel. She sat on the edge of the bed and let herself cry for exactly 2 minutes. Then she washed her face, said her prayers, and went to sleep. Tomorrow she would make a plan. Tomorrow she would figure out how to survive this. But tonight, she was simply too tired to be afraid. Clara woke to knocking. The sun was barely up, the room still gray with pre-dawn light. She struggled out of bed, disoriented, and opened the door. Ethan stood there with a cup of coffee. "Thought you might need this," he said. She took it automatically. The tin cup was warm in her hands. "There's breakfast in the kitchen when you're ready. Nothing fancy." He paused. "I need to ride out to check the north fence. Should be back by noon. If you need anything, Miguel's in the barn." "Miguel?" "Ranch hand. He doesn't talk much, but he's harmless." Ethan turned to go, then stopped. "Thank you. For last night. The kitchen." Clara nodded, unsure what to say. He left. She drank the coffee standing in the doorway, watching the sky lighten over the mountains. It was terrible coffee, too strong, too bitter. But it was hot and it was kind, and that was enough. When she entered the kitchen, she found eggs and bread waiting on the table. Simple, but carefully arranged. She ate alone, planning her day. Then she got to work. The house revealed itself slowly, room by room. The main room with its stone fireplace and sparse furniture. 2 bedrooms, one clearly Ethan's, the other empty except for dust and a broken chair. A storage room full of things that hadn't been touched in years. Clara cleaned methodically, taking inventory of what existed and what was needed. The list grew long. Around mid-morning, she ventured outside. The barn was larger than the house and in better repair. Inside, a man was working on a saddle, older than Ethan, Mexican, with silver in his hair and wariness in his eyes. "Miguel?" Clara asked. He looked up, nodded once. "I'm Clara, the new housekeeper." Another nod. "I'm making a list of supplies we need from town. Is there anything for the barn or the animals?" Miguel studied her for a long moment. Then he stood, walked to a shelf, and pulled down a scrap of paper. Handed it to her without a word. The handwriting was careful, precise. A short list of items. "Thank you," Clara said. He returned to his work. Clara went back to the house, adding Miguel's items to her own list. By the time Ethan returned, she had filled 3 pages. He read through them slowly, his expression unreadable. "This is thorough," he said finally. "The house needs work." "I know." He set the papers down. "This is going to cost more than I planned." Clara felt her stomach drop. "I can reduce—" "No." He looked at her. "You're right. It all needs doing. I've just been putting it off." He was quiet for a moment. "We'll go to town tomorrow. Get what we can. I can make do with—" "Miss Whitmore." His voice was firm but not unkind. "If you're going to work here, you should have the tools to do it properly. We'll get the supplies." Clara nodded slowly. That night she cooked the first real meal the house had seen in months. Nothing fancy, stew made from salt pork and old potatoes, but she made biscuits to go with it and brewed coffee that was actually drinkable. She served Ethan and Miguel in the kitchen, then started to retreat to her quarters with her own plate. "You can eat here," Ethan said. Clara paused. "I thought—" "You cooked it. Seems wrong to make you eat alone in that shed." He gestured to the empty chair. "Your choice." She sat. They ate in silence, the 3 of them, while the lamp burned low and shadows gathered in the corners. It wasn't comfortable exactly, but it wasn't hostile either. And for Clara, who had spent the last 24 hours navigating one rejection after another, that was something close to a miracle. The trip to Silver Ridge the next morning was tense. Clara sat beside Ethan on the wagon bench, acutely aware of every eye that turned their direction as they rolled down Main Street. Word had spread clearly. She could feel the speculation, the judgment, the whispers that followed in their wake. That's her. The one Wardell rejected. Now she's working for Calloway. The implications hung in the air like smoke. Ethan felt it too. His jaw was tight, his hands careful on the reins. "Ignore them," he said quietly. "I intend to." They stopped first at the general store. Not Wardell's Mercantile, Clara noted with relief, but a smaller establishment run by an elderly couple. The woman behind the counter looked at Clara with open curiosity, but no malice. "You're the new girl at Redstone?" she asked, while tallying their order. "I'm the housekeeper, yes." "Ethan finally hired someone. Miracles do happen." The woman smiled. "I'm Mrs. Chen. You need anything, you come see me. Don't let these fools in town bother you none." It was the first kindness Clara had received from anyone in Silver Ridge besides Ethan. "Thank you," she managed. They loaded the wagon with supplies, soap and fabric and flour and nails, and 100 other things. The bill came to more than Clara had expected. Ethan paid without hesitation, but she saw the tightness around his eyes. Money was scarce here, too. They were loading the last crate when Thomas Wardell appeared. He stepped out of his mercantile across the street, saw them, and stopped. For a moment, Clara thought he might turn around and leave. Instead, he straightened his vest and walked over. "Calloway," he said with forced pleasantness, "I see you've taken on extra help." "Miss Whitmore is my housekeeper," Ethan replied evenly. Wardell's eyes slid to Clara. There was something in his expression, not quite guilt, but close, and under it something uglier, satisfaction maybe, at seeing her brought low. "I hope the arrangement works out better than—" He paused delicately. "Well, better than previous plans." Clara felt heat rush to her face. "Mr. Wardell," she said clearly, "I hope you find a wife who meets your standards, one who knows when to keep her opinions to herself." His face reddened. "Now see here." "We're done here," Ethan cut in. He climbed onto the wagon and offered Clara his hand. She took it and let him pull her up onto the bench. As they pulled away, Clara looked back once. Wardell stood in the street, watching them go, his expression caught between anger and something that might have been regret. Clara turned forward and didn't look back again. They were almost out of town when Ethan spoke. "That was brave," he said. "What you said to him. It was petty." "Maybe, but sometimes petty feels good." Clara almost smiled. Almost. They rode in silence for a while, the town falling away behind them, the open country spreading wide. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said finally. "Go ahead." "Why do you really need a housekeeper?" Ethan was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Because I'm tired of living like I'm already dead." Clara looked at him sharply. "The house fell apart because I stopped caring," he continued, eyes on the road ahead. "Stopped seeing it as a home, just a place to sleep between work." He paused. "Hiring you is me trying to, I don't know, remember what it feels like to have a life instead of just a routine. That's honest. You asked." They were quiet again. Then Clara said, "Can I ask something else?" "Sure." "What happened to your wife?" She felt him go still beside her. "Sorry," she added quickly. "That was too—" "I don't have a wife," Ethan said carefully. "Never did." Clara frowned. "But the way the house looked, like someone left—" "My mother." His voice was flat. "She died 3 years ago. I haven't been able to bring myself to change anything since. I'm sorry." "Don't be. You're here to fix it. That's what I hired you for." But there was something in his voice, a rawness that told Clara she'd touched a wound that hadn't healed. She didn't ask anything else after that. When they reached Redstone, Ethan helped her unload the supplies in silence. Then he disappeared into the barn, and Clara didn't see him again until supper. She spent the afternoon organizing her new supplies, scrubbing windows, beating dust from curtains. Physical work. Good, honest labor that kept her hands busy and her mind from wandering to dangerous territory. Like the fact that she was now living on a remote ranch with a man she barely knew. Like the fact that she had no idea what would come next. Like the fact that for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel completely hopeless. That night, after Miguel and Ethan had eaten and gone to their respective corners, Clara sat alone in the kitchen with her mother's letters. She'd been carrying them in her suitcase, reading them over and over during the long train ride west. Her mother's careful handwriting, full of worry and hope, and desperate faith that Clara's marriage would solve everything. "We're so proud of you for being brave. This is the right thing. You'll see." Clara folded the letters carefully and put them away. Tomorrow she would write back. Tell them something. Not the truth, they couldn't handle the truth, but something that would keep them from worrying. Tomorrow she would be practical. But tonight, sitting in a clean kitchen in a house that was slowly coming back to life, Clara let herself imagine, just for a moment, what it might feel like to build something here. Not a marriage, not what she'd planned, but maybe something better, something that was actually hers. The first week passed in a blur of work that left Clara's hands cracked and bleeding. She scrubbed floors until her knees bruised, washed windows until her shoulders screamed, mended curtains by lamplight until her eyes burned and she could barely see straight. The house fought her every step. Years of neglect don't surrender easily, but Clara was stubborn in ways that surprised even herself. By the end of that first week, the main room had curtains that didn't smell like mildew. The kitchen floor no longer stuck to her shoes. The windows let in actual light instead of filtering everything through layers of grime. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. Ethan noticed, though he didn't say much. He'd come in from working the land, pause in the doorway, and just look around like he was seeing the place for the first time. Then he'd nod once and head to his room to wash up for supper. Miguel was even less talkative if that was possible. But on the fifth day, Clara found a stool outside her door, sturdy, handmade, the right height for reaching high shelves. She'd mentioned needing one exactly once, in passing, while Miguel was oiling tack in the barn. He'd been listening. The routine settled into something almost comfortable. Clara woke before dawn, started the stove, made coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Ethan and Miguel would appear like ghosts, eat whatever she put in front of them, and disappear back into the work that never seemed to end. She'd spend the day attacking another section of the house, and by evening they'd all collapse around the kitchen table, too tired to do much beyond eat and stare at their plates. It wasn't the life Clara had imagined when she'd boarded that train, but it was a life, and more importantly, it was hers to shape. On the eighth day, everything changed. Clara was in the storage room, sorting through boxes that probably hadn't been touched in a decade, when she found the ledgers. 3 of them leather-bound, filled with careful handwriting that chronicled years of ranch expenses and income. The most recent one ended abruptly 3 years ago, right around the time Ethan said his mother had died. Clara knew she shouldn't look. It was none of her business. She looked anyway. The numbers told a story that made her stomach clench. Redstone Ranch was dying. Had been dying for years, actually, bleeding money from a dozen different wounds. Cattle lost to drought and disease. Fences that needed constant repair. Equipment breaking down faster than it could be replaced. And underneath it all, a debt that kept growing like a cancer. The last entry was particularly stark. A payment missed. A warning from the bank in Silver Ridge. That was 3 years ago. Clara closed the ledger carefully and sat back on her heels, thinking. She should put it back. Forget she saw it. It wasn't her problem. But her mind was already working through the numbers, seeing patterns, identifying mistakes that could be fixed with better planning. The practical part of her, the part that had managed her family's meager household funds for years, that had stretched pennies into dollars through sheer force of will, was already mapping out solutions. She found Ethan in the barn that evening, working on a broken water pump. "Can I talk to you?" she asked. He looked up, wiping grease from his hands. "Something wrong?" "No, maybe. I don't know." Clara took a breath. "I found the ledgers." His expression went carefully blank. "Those are private." "I know, I'm sorry. I was just cleaning and I saw them and I—" She trailed off. "I looked. I shouldn't have, but I did." Ethan set down his tools slowly. "And?" "And you're in trouble." "I know I'm in trouble." "No, I mean real trouble. The kind that ends with you losing this place." He laughed, sharp and bitter. "You think I don't know that? Why do you think the house looked like it did? Why do you think I'm out here fixing a pump that should have been replaced 2 years ago with my bare hands instead of hiring someone? Because you can't afford to hire anyone." "Exactly." They stood there in the dim barn, the truth hanging between them like smoke. "How bad is it?" Clara asked quietly. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed, defeat written in every line of his body. "Bad enough that I'm about 6 months from losing everything. Maybe less if we have another bad season." "What about the bank? Can you renegotiate?" "The bank won't give me another extension. I've already asked, twice." He picked up a wrench, turned it over in his hands. "There's 2 men in this valley who want this land. Stuart Bishop and Frank Dalton. They own most of the water rights around here, and they've been buying up failing ranches for years. They're waiting for me to go under so they can swoop in and take Redstone for pennies on the dollar. Why do they want it so badly? Because this ranch sits right in the middle of their holdings, and because there's a spring on the north property that never runs dry, even in drought years. Whoever controls that spring controls the whole valley. He met her eyes. My mother knew that. She held on to this place with her fingernails because she understood what would happen if Bishop or Dalton got their hands on it. But I'm not her. I don't have her head for business or her ability to make something out of nothing. Clara felt something shift inside her chest. Let me see everything. All the books, all the debts, everything. Why? Because I'm good with numbers. Because I can see things you might have missed. Because maybe... She stopped herself. Because maybe what? Because maybe I can help. Ethan stared at her. You've been here 8 days. I know. You're a housekeeper. I know that too. That. Why would you... He shook his head. You don't owe me anything, Clara. I gave you a job. That's all. You don't need to save my ranch. Maybe I'm not doing it for you, Clara said quietly. Maybe I'm doing it because I need to know I'm worth more than Thomas Wardell decided in 30 seconds. The words hung in the air between them. Ethan's expression softened into something Clara couldn't quite read. All right, he said finally. I'll get you the books. They spent that night at the kitchen table, ledgers spread out between them, oil lamp burning low. Ethan walked her through every entry, every debt, every failed attempt to make the numbers work. His voice was matter-of-fact, clinical, but Clara could hear the exhaustion underneath. This man had been fighting alone for 3 years, and he was losing. By midnight, Clara had filled 6 pages with notes and calculations. Her head ached, and her eyes burned, but she could see it now, the full picture of Redstone's slow collapse. You're spending too much on feed, she said, tapping one entry. You're buying from Morrison's at full price when you could get it cheaper from the supplier in Ridgecrest if you bought in bulk. Ridgecrest is 2 days' ride from here, so make the trip once a month instead of buying small amounts every week. The savings would more than cover the time. She moved to another page. And you're not selling your cattle at the right time. You're waiting until you desperately need the money, which means you're selling when prices are low. I sell when I have to. I know, but if you plan better, you could hold out for better prices. Even a few dollars more per head would add up. Clara looked up at him. The problem isn't that you're a bad rancher. The problem is that you're trying to do everything yourself and you're so focused on surviving day to day that you can't see the bigger pattern. Ethan rubbed his face with both hands. Even if you're right, and you probably are, it doesn't solve the main problem. I'm behind on the bank payments. They want $800 by the end of next month, or they're calling the note. $800. Clara felt her heart sink. That was more money than she could even imagine. How much do you have? She asked. Maybe 200 if I sell every head of cattle I can spare and don't eat for a month. The math was brutal. Even if they implemented every efficiency Clara could think of, there was no way to close that gap in 4 weeks. Clara stared at the ledgers, thinking furiously. What if you had a partner? She asked slowly. Ethan looked up. What? Someone with a stake in the ranch, someone who could vouch for your ability to make payments. Banks are more willing to extend credit to married men, aren't they? Because it shows stability. Clara, I'm not talking about a real marriage. I'm talking about an arrangement. The idea was forming as she spoke, crazy and desperate and maybe brilliant. We tell people we got married, quietly, no fuss. I'm already living here, already working the ranch. It wouldn't be that hard to convince people. And if the bank thinks you have a wife, a household, a stable situation, they'd still want their money. But they might give you more time, especially if they think you're turning things around. Clara leaned forward. And we would be. Turning things around, I mean. With 2 people managing things instead of 1, with better planning, with... You want to fake a marriage to trick a bank. Ethan's voice was flat. I want to give you a fighting chance to keep your ranch. Why? The question came out harsh. Why would you do this? You barely know me. Clara met his eyes. Because I have nowhere else to go. Because this is the first place I've felt like I could actually build something since my father died. And because if I'm going to be stuck in this territory anyway, I'd rather be stuck somewhere that's mine instead of working in some saloon or begging Thomas Wardell to reconsider. This is crazy. Probably. It could backfire. If people find out, then we'll be in the same position we're in now. What do you have to lose? Ethan was quiet for a long time, staring at the ledgers like they might suddenly reveal a better answer. They didn't. Separate quarters, he said finally. That part doesn't change. Clara's heart jumped. Of course. And if it doesn't work, if the bank won't budge, then we end it. Clean break. I'll give you enough money to get back east or wherever you want to go. Agreed. And we tell Miguel the truth. I won't lie to him. Clara nodded. Okay. Ethan stood up, walked to the window, stared out into the darkness. When he spoke again, his voice was different, quieter. My mother would have liked you, he said. She was practical too, and she never backed down from a bad situation. Clara didn't know what to say to that. Ethan turned back to face her. All right, let's do it. They shook hands across the table, sealing a bargain that was equal parts business arrangement and mutual desperation. And just like that, Clara Whitmore agreed to become a pretend wife. The next morning, Ethan told Miguel. They were in the barn, the three of them, and Clara watched Miguel's face carefully as Ethan explained the situation. The older man listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Ethan finished, Miguel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, This is about the bank. Yes. And Bishop and Dalton. Yes. Miguel looked at Clara, really looked at her, like he was trying to see past her surface to whatever lay underneath. You know what you're doing? He asked her. No, Clara admitted, but I'm doing it anyway. Something flickered in Miguel's eyes, almost like approval. Your mother, he said to Ethan, she would say this is loco. I know. She would also say it might work. Miguel shrugged. Okay, we do this, but if it goes wrong, I tell you I warned you. Fair enough? That afternoon, Clara and Ethan rode into Silver Ridge together. They went straight to the general store, where Mrs. Chen greeted them with her usual warmth. Ethan, Clara, what can I do for you today? We need to order a few things, Ethan said. And we wanted to let you know Clara and I got married yesterday. Quiet ceremony, just us and Miguel as witness. Mrs. Chen's eyes went wide. Then her face split into a huge smile. Married! Well, congratulations. Oh, this is wonderful news. Clara forced herself to smile back, wondering if her face looked as stiff as it felt. We're keeping it simple, she said. No big announcement, but we didn't want people to be confused when they saw us in town together. Of course, Mrs. Chen was already bustling around the counter. You'll need to register it at the courthouse, you know. Make it official. Ethan and Clara exchanged a glance. They hadn't thought of that. We'll handle that today, Ethan said smoothly. Just wanted to stop here first. News spread through Silver Ridge like wildfire. By the time they left Mrs. Chen's store, 3 people had already stopped to offer awkward congratulations. By the time they reached the courthouse, it felt like half the town knew. The clerk who handled the marriage registration was a thin man with suspicious eyes. You got married yesterday? He asked, looking between them. That's right, Ethan said. By who? Miguel Herrera, Clara said. He's authorized to perform marriages, isn't he? She had no idea if that was true, but she said it with enough confidence that the clerk hesitated. I'll need to verify that. We can wait. It took 20 minutes of the clerk shuffling through papers and muttering to himself before he finally, grudgingly, accepted their story. He made them sign a document, collected a fee, and stamped it with obvious reluctance. There, he said. You're registered, legally married in the eyes of the territory. Clara stared at the paper with her signature next to Ethan's. It was done. They were married. On paper, at least. The bank was their last stop. The building was imposing, 2 stories of brick and arrogance in a town of wood and dust. Ethan held the door for Clara and they stepped inside together. A young clerk looked up from his desk. Can I help you? We need to speak with Mr. Harrison about the Redstone account, Ethan said. The clerk's expression shifted. I'll see if he's available. They waited in uncomfortable chairs while the clerk disappeared into a back office. Clara could hear muffled voices, though she couldn't make out the words. Finally, a portly man in an expensive suit emerged. Mr. Calloway, he said with false warmth. What a surprise. Mr. Harrison. Ethan stood, gestured to Clara. This is my wife, Clara. We were married yesterday. Harrison's eyebrows rose. Wife? I wasn't aware you were engaged. It was a quick courtship, Clara said smoothly. Sometimes you just know. Harrison studied her with the same calculating expression Thomas Wardell had used. Clara lifted her chin and stared back. Well, Harrison said finally, congratulations. Though I'm not sure how this changes our previous discussions about the Redstone note. It changes everything, Ethan said. I have a partner now, someone to help run the ranch properly. We've been going over the books, and we've identified several areas where we can improve efficiency and increase revenue. That's all very optimistic, but the bank needs more than optimism. We need $800 by the end of next month. We'll have it, Clara said. Both men looked at her. We'll have it, she repeated. We're selling cattle this week at better prices than Ethan's gotten before. We're renegotiating supplier contracts, and we're implementing better financial planning that will ensure consistent payments going forward. Harrison's expression was skeptical. Mrs. Calloway, ranching is complicated business. I managed my family's household accounts for 6 years through poverty that would make your head spin, Clara interrupted. I know how to stretch money. I know how to find inefficiencies. And I know how to make hard choices when necessary. She leaned forward slightly. Give us 3 months. If we miss a single payment, you can call the note. But if we make our payments on time, you extend our terms by a year. That's not how we typically... Your other option is to call the note now and take possession of a ranch that's falling apart, Clara continued. Then you'll have to find a buyer, probably Bishop or Dalton, who will lowball you because they know you're desperate to move it. You'll get maybe half what the property's worth. She paused. Or you could work with us, take your payments on time, and keep a reliable customer who will actually improve the property value. Harrison looked at Ethan. Does she always negotiate like this? Apparently, Ethan said, and Clara could hear something almost like amusement in his voice. Harrison drummed his fingers on his desk, thinking. 3 months, he said finally. But I want to see detailed financial reports, monthly. And if you miss even one payment, we won't, Clara said. See that you don't. Harrison stood, signaling the meeting was over. And Mrs. Calloway? Welcome to Silver Ridge. I have a feeling things just got more interesting around here. They left the bank in stunned silence. Once they were outside, Ethan stopped and looked at Clara like he'd never seen her before. What? She asked. You just backed a banker into a corner and made him like it. I told you I was practical. That wasn't practical. That was terrifying. He shook his head. Where did you learn to do that? Watching my mother beg landlords for 1 more week. Watching my father negotiate prices at markets when we had nothing left to sell. Clara started walking toward the wagon. You learn a lot about leverage when you're desperate. They rode back to the ranch in silence, but it was different than before. More comfortable, like they'd crossed some invisible line and ended up as actual allies instead of just 2 people making a deal. When they reached Redstone, Miguel was waiting on the porch. Well, he asked. We're married, Ethan said. Officially. And the bank gave us 3 months. Miguel nodded slowly. Then we better get to work. And that's exactly what they did. The next 3 weeks were brutal. Ethan and Miguel worked the cattle from dawn until dark, cutting out the best heads for market. Clara took over the financial planning entirely, creating detailed budgets and schedules that accounted for every penny. She negotiated with suppliers, haggled over prices, and discovered she had a talent for finding loopholes in contracts. The house continued to improve. Clara worked on it in stolen moments between managing the books, patching holes, mending furniture, planting vegetables in the garden that would save them money on food. She also started wearing a thin gold band on her left hand. It had belonged to Ethan's mother, and he'd given it to her without ceremony one evening. People will expect it, he'd said. Clara had slipped it on, feeling the weight of it, the lie of it, but also the protection of it, because wearing that ring changed how people looked at her in town. She was no longer the rejected mail-order bride or the suspicious housekeeper. She was Mrs. Calloway, respectable rancher's wife, and that came with a kind of armor she hadn't had before. It also came with problems. On the 20th day, Clara was in town picking up supplies when she ran into Thomas Wardell. She'd been doing her best to avoid him, but Silver Ridge was small, and luck only stretched so far. He was coming out of the bank as she was going in. They nearly collided. Mrs. Calloway, he said, and there was something ugly in his voice. Mr. Wardell. Clara tried to step around him. He moved to block her path. Quite the rapid courtship you had with Calloway. Some might find the timing suspicious. Some might find it none of their business. I wrote to your family, Wardell said. Clara's blood went cold. You what? Your mother, specifically. Told her you'd arrived safely and found suitable employment. Thought she'd want to know, since you were supposed to be marrying me. His smile was sharp. Funny thing, though. I didn't mention your sudden marriage to Calloway. Thought I'd let you explain that yourself. Clara felt rage rise hot in her chest. You had no right. I had every right. I paid for your ticket. That gives me certain considerations. You rejected me. I changed my mind about marriage. That doesn't mean I wanted you making a fool of me by turning around and marrying someone else within days. He leaned closer. People talk, Mrs. Calloway. They're already saying you and Calloway were carrying on before you even arrived, that the whole mail order arrangement was just a ruse to get you out here. That's absurd, is it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you played me for a fool. Clara wanted to hit him, wanted to scream. Instead, she drew herself up and spoke with ice-cold clarity. Mr. Wardell, you looked at me for 30 seconds and decided I was too opinionated to marry. You didn't want a wife. You wanted decoration. Someone pretty and quiet who would make you look good. She stepped closer. I'm sorry I wasn't what you wanted, but I'm not sorry I found something better. She pushed past him and into the bank before he could respond. Her hands were shaking. That night, she told Ethan what had happened. They were in the kitchen going over the weekly accounts when Clara finally forced the words out. Wardell contacted my mother. Ethan looked up sharply. What? Clara explained the whole encounter, watching his expression darken with each sentence. What did you tell your family? He asked when she finished. About us? Nothing yet. I've been putting off writing because I didn't know what to say. Clara rubbed her face. They think I married Wardell. They're probably planning how to spend the money I promised to send. We'll send money, Ethan said. Once we get through this rough patch. I can't take money from you for my family. That's not part of our arrangement. Clara, no. She was firm. I'll write them. Tell them the truth. That the marriage to Wardell fell through, but I found work and I'm doing fine. And when Wardell tells them you married me, then I'll deal with it. Clara looked at the ledgers spread across the table. One crisis at a time. But the letter to her mother was harder to write than she'd expected. Clara sat up late that night trying to find words that were honest without being devastating. Her mother was fragile, always had been. The shock of learning her daughter was living unmarried with a strange man in a remote ranch, even if it was all perfectly proper, might be too much. So Clara lied. She wrote that Thomas Wardell had been a disappointment, but that she'd found excellent employment with a respectable family. She was safe, she was eating well, and she'd send money as soon as she was able. The words felt hollow on the page, but they were safer than the truth. She mailed the letter the next day and tried not to think about what would happen when Wardell's version of events reached her mother first. The cattle sale happened 2 days later. Ethan and Miguel drove 30 head to a buyer 3 towns over, a man Clara had found through careful networking and letter writing. He paid 15% more than the local buyers would have offered. When Ethan came back with the cash, he spread it on the kitchen table and they counted it together. $340. Combined with what they already had, it put them at $520. Still short, but closer. We need to sell more, Ethan said. We can't. Claire had run the numbers a dozen times. If we sell any more cattle now, we won't have enough to rebuild the herd. We'd be trading short-term survival for long-term collapse. Then what do you suggest? Clara had been thinking about this for days. She pulled out a piece of paper covered in calculations. The spring, she said, the one on the north property. You said it never runs dry. That's right. What if we sold water rights, not permanent ownership, just seasonal access? There's at least 4 ranches downstream that could use reliable water, especially in drought years. Ethan stared at her. My mother always refused to do that. She said once you start selling off water, you lose control. I'm not talking about selling control. I'm talking about leasing access, contracts that renew yearly with terms we set. We charge enough to cover what we need now, and in better years it becomes pure profit. Bishop and Dalton would lose their minds. They've been controlling water access in this valley for years. Good, Clara said flatly. Let them be angry. They don't own that spring, you do. Ethan was quiet for a long time, thinking it through. It could work, he said finally, but it's risky. If we miscalculate, we could end up in a worse position. And if we make enemies of Bishop and Dalton, we're already in a bad position, and they're already planning to take this ranch the minute you fail. At least this way we're fighting back. Ethan looked at her with something Clara couldn't quite name. You're sure about this? He asked. No, but I'm willing to try. He nodded slowly. All right, let's do it. They spent the next week drafting contracts and reaching out to neighboring ranchers. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Nobody liked being under Bishop and Dalton's thumb, and the chance to secure independent water access was worth paying for. By the end of the month, they had agreements with 3 ranchers that would bring in $280 before the bank deadline. It was enough. Barely, but enough. The morning they were supposed to make the bank payment, Clara woke before dawn with her stomach in knots. Everything was riding on this. If Harrison rejected their payment, if he decided to call the note anyway, if anything went wrong, she pushed the thoughts away and got dressed. Ethan was already in the kitchen, looking as tense as she felt. Ready? He asked. Clara nodded. They rode to Silver Ridge in silence, the money hidden in Ethan's saddlebag. Miguel stayed behind to watch the ranch. Someone had to, and they all knew this was Clara and Ethan's fight. The bank was busy when they arrived, full of people conducting normal business. Clara felt their eyes on her and Ethan as they walked to Harrison's office. The banker looked up from his desk with raised eyebrows. Mr. and Mrs. Calloway, you're early. We have your payment, Ethan said. Harrison's expression shifted to something like surprise. All of it? Clara set the cash on the desk. Count it. Harrison did, slowly and carefully. When he finished, he sat back in his chair. $800. Exactly. He looked between them. I'll admit, I didn't think you'd make it. We said we would, Clara replied. So you did. Harrison pulled out a receipt book and started writing. I'll update your account. The terms we discussed, monthly payments, detailed reports, those still stand. We understand, Ethan said. Harrison handed over the receipt and stood to shake Ethan's hand. Then, almost as an afterthought, he offered his hand to Clara. She took it. You got steel in you, Mrs. Calloway, Harrison said. This valley could use more of that. They left the bank and stepped into the bright morning sun. Ethan didn't say anything, just stood there on the boardwalk, staring at the receipt like he couldn't quite believe it was real. We did it, Clara said quietly. You did it. Ethan looked at her. I would have lost this place without you. You would have figured something out. No. His voice was firm. I wouldn't have. I was drowning, and I didn't even know it. You came in and saw what I couldn't see, and you saved me. He paused. Thank you. Clara felt something catch in her chest. You gave me a chance when no one else would. We're even. They weren't even, not really, but it seemed like the right thing to say. They were halfway back to the ranch when they saw the riders. 3 men on horseback waiting on the road. Even from a distance, Clara could tell they weren't friendly. Ethan tensed beside her. That's Frank Dalton in the middle. Clara studied the men as they approached. Dalton was in his 50s, broad and brutal-looking, with eyes that assessed everything like he was calculating its worth. The men flanking him were younger, harder, with the look of people who solved problems with violence. Ethan pulled the wagon to a stop. Calloway, Dalton said by way of greeting. Heard you made your bank payment. News travels fast. It does in a small town. Dalton's eyes slid to Clara. Also heard you got married. Congratulations. Thank you, Clara said evenly. Funny thing, though, Dalton continued, I also heard you've been selling water rights, my water rights. Your water rights? Ethan's voice was hard. That spring is on my land. Water doesn't recognize property lines, boy. It flows downstream to my ranch and Bishop's ranch. We've been managing that resource for years. You got no right to disrupt the arrangement. I have every right. It's my property. Dalton's expression darkened. You're making a mistake. The only mistake, Clara cut in, would be letting you continue to control resources that don't belong to you. All 3 men looked at her like they'd forgotten she could talk. Ma'am, Dalton said with exaggerated patience, this is ranch business. Maybe you should let your husband handle it. My husband and I make decisions together, Claire replied, and we've decided that Redstone Ranch will operate independently from your control. If you have a problem with that, take it up with our lawyer. They didn't have a lawyer. But Dalton didn't need to know that. The big man's face flushed red. You're going to regret this. Is that a threat? Ethan asked quietly. It's a promise. Dalton yanked his horse's head around. This valley doesn't take kindly to people who don't know their place. You'd do well to remember that. He rode off, his men following. Clara and Ethan sat in silence for a moment. That was either very brave or very stupid, Ethan said finally. Probably both. He meant what he said. He and Bishop don't make idle threats. I know. Clara's hands were shaking slightly, but she kept her voice steady. But we can't back down now. If we show weakness, they'll never stop pushing. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he snapped the reins and the wagon started moving again. We're going to need to be careful, he said. Both of us. Dalton's not the kind of man who forgives challenges to his authority. Then we'll be careful. But as they drove back to Redstone, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they'd just started something neither of them knew how to finish. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed, listening to the wind and thinking about Dalton's face, the promise of retribution in his eyes. Around midnight, she gave up trying to rest and went to sit on the porch. Ethan was already there. He looked over as she settled into the chair beside him. Can't sleep either? No. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars. I keep thinking about what my mother would say, Ethan said eventually, about all this. The fake marriage, the water rights, challenging Dalton and Bishop. What do you think she'd say? Probably that I was an idiot. He smiled slightly. But also that sometimes being an idiot is the only choice that makes sense. Clara pulled her shawl tighter. Tell me about her. Ethan was quiet so long that Clara thought he wouldn't answer. Then he started talking, his voice soft in the darkness. She was tough. Had to be. My father died when I was 8, and she ran this place alone for 20 years. Everyone said she should sell, find a new husband, do something sensible. She told them all to go to hell and made Redstone profitable out of pure spite. He paused. She taught me everything about ranching, everything about this land. And when she got sick, she made me promise I'd hold on to it, that I wouldn't let Bishop or Dalton win. You kept your promise. Barely. And only because you showed up. He looked at her. She would have liked you, would have said you had backbone. Clara felt warmth spread through her chest. I wish I could have met her. Me too. They fell quiet again, but it was different now, closer. Can I ask you something? Ethan said. Sure. Why did you really agree to this? The fake marriage, I mean. You said it was because you had nowhere else to go, but I don't think that's the whole truth. Clara considered lying, then decided against it. Because I was tired of being powerless, she said quietly. My whole life, I've been at the mercy of other people's decisions. My father's debts, my mother's weakness, Thomas Wardell's rejection. I was so tired of having things happen to me instead of making things happen. She looked at him. This arrangement, pretending to be your wife, helping save the ranch, it's the first time I've felt like I had any control over my own life. Even though it's built on a lie? Especially because it's built on a lie I chose. Ethan nodded slowly, like that made perfect sense to him. For what it's worth, he said, I don't think of you as my employee anymore. What do you think of me as? He considered the question carefully. My partner, in this mess we're making together. Clara smiled. I can live with that. They sat on that porch until the sky started to lighten, talking about everything and nothing. When the first rays of sun crept over the mountains, Clara stood to start breakfast and Ethan headed to the barn. The routine pulled them back into separate orbits, but something had shifted between them in those dark hours. The next 2 months passed in a rhythm that almost felt normal. Clara managed the books with an intensity that surprised even her. She found efficiencies in places Ethan had never thought to look, renegotiated every contract she could touch, and slowly, painfully slowly, the ranch's finances started to stabilize. The water rights agreements brought in steady income. The cattle herd was rebuilding. The garden produced enough vegetables to cut their food costs significantly. But Dalton and Bishop hadn't forgotten. It started small. Fences cut in the night, cattle spooked and scattered across the valley, taking days to round up. Supplies that went missing between town and the ranch. Nothing they could prove, but everyone knew. Ethan started carrying his rifle everywhere. Miguel slept in the barn some nights, keeping watch. And Clara learned to recognize the sound of horses approaching in the dark. The tension wore on all of them. Then the drought hit. July came in hot and mean, with skies so blue they hurt to look at, and not a cloud in sight. The grass turned brown. Creek beds dried up. Every rancher in the valley started watching their water supplies with growing desperation. Everyone except Redstone. The spring on the north property kept flowing, just like Ethan had said it would. While other ranches rationed water for their herds, Redstone's cattle drank their fill. While neighboring gardens withered, Clara's vegetables survived, and that made them a target. Clara was in the garden one afternoon, fighting with stubborn weeds, when she heard the wagon. She stood, shading her eyes, and recognized Stuart Bishop before he'd even climbed down. He was older than Dalton, maybe 60, with silver hair and the kind of face that looked friendly until you noticed the eyes. Those were cold and calculating. "Mrs. Calloway," he called out pleasantly. "Hope I'm not disturbing you." Clara wiped her hands on her apron. "Mr. Bishop, what can I do for you?" "Just wanted to stop by and see how you folks are managing in this heat." He looked around the property with obvious appraisal. "Ranch looks good, better than it has in years. We've been making improvements. So I hear." Bishop moved closer, still smiling. "Also hear you've been selling water access. That true?" "We've leased seasonal rights to a few neighbors. Yes. Smart business, very smart." He nodded approvingly. "Must be bringing in good money, especially now with the drought." Clara said nothing, waiting for whatever was coming next. "Thing is," Bishop continued, "that puts you in an interesting position. You've got the only reliable water for miles, and people are getting desperate. Desperate people do stupid things." "Is that a warning?" "It's friendly advice." His smile never wavered. "You're new to this valley, Mrs. Calloway. You don't understand how things work here. There's a natural order, and when someone disrupts it, well, things tend to get complicated." "We're not disrupting anything. We're managing our own resources." "Your husband know you're out here alone?" Bishop asked, changing tactics. "Seems dangerous, a woman by herself in times like these." The threat was barely veiled. Clara felt ice run down her spine, but she kept her voice steady. "Miguel's in the barn. Ethan's checking the north fence. I'm hardly alone." "Still, you should be careful." Bishop tipped his hat. "Accidents happen on ranches, especially when people get careless." He left without another word, his wagon kicking up dust as it rolled away. Clara stood there for a long moment, her heart pounding, before she went to find Ethan. He was exactly where she'd said he'd be, working on the fence line. When she told him about Bishop's visit, his jaw tightened. "He came to the house?" "Yes." "While I was gone?" "Yes." Ethan threw down the hammer he'd been holding. "He was testing us, seeing if you'd scare easy." "Well, I didn't." "I know, but that might make things worse." He looked at her seriously. "These men don't like being challenged, Clara, especially not by women." "Then they're going to have a hard few months, aren't they?" Despite everything, Ethan almost smiled. "You're not going to back down?" "No." "Even if it gets dangerous?" Clara thought about the question carefully. A month ago, she might have said yes, might have agreed to be cautious and quiet and safe. But she'd spent too many years being careful, too many years making herself small to fit other people's expectations. "I'm not looking for danger," she said finally, "but I'm not running from it either. This ranch is as much mine now as it is yours. I'm not letting Bishop or Dalton take it." Ethan studied her face for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right, then we need to be smart about this." They spent that evening making plans. Extra locks on the doors, a schedule for checking the property, signals between the house and the barn in case of trouble. Miguel listened to it all without comment, his expression grave. "This is going to get worse before it gets better," he said when they finished. "I know," Ethan replied. "You sure she should stay?" Miguel looked at Clara. "No offense, Senora, but if something happens—" "I'm staying," Clara interrupted. "This isn't up for debate." Miguel raised his hands in surrender. "Okay. Then we protect the ranch. All of us." That night, Clara lay awake listening to every sound. The wind in the eaves, mice in the walls, the distant howl of coyotes. Every noise made her wonder if it was something worse. She must have finally fallen asleep because she woke to shouting. Clara stumbled out of bed, her heart racing, and threw open the door. Smoke. She could smell smoke. The barn was on fire. She ran toward it without thinking, still in her nightgown, and found Ethan and Miguel already there with buckets. The flames were concentrated on one corner. Someone had set it deliberately, she realized with sick certainty. "Get water!" Ethan yelled when he saw her. Clara ran to the pump, filled every bucket she could find, and joined the desperate effort to save the structure. The horses were screaming inside. Miguel got them out while Ethan and Clara fought the fire, throwing water on flames that seemed determined to consume everything. It took an hour. By the time they got it under control, all three of them were covered in soot and ash, coughing and exhausted. The barn had survived, but barely. One whole corner was charred black, and the smell of burnt wood hung heavy in the air. "This was Bishop," Ethan said flatly, staring at the damage. "Or Dalton, maybe both." "Can you prove it?" Clara asked. "No, that's the point." Miguel was checking the horses, making sure none were injured. "We got lucky," he called out. "Another few minutes, and we'd have lost the whole thing." Clara looked around at the destruction and felt rage build in her chest. This was meant to scare them, meant to drive them off their own land. Instead, it just made her angrier. "We need to report this," she said. Ethan shook his head. "To who?" "The sheriff's in Bishop's pocket. He'll take a statement and do nothing. So we just let them get away with it?" "We rebuild. We keep going. And we make sure it doesn't happen again." Ethan's voice was hard. "That's how we fight back. By refusing to quit." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to demand justice or revenge or something that felt like winning, but she could see the exhaustion in Ethan's face, the defeat he was trying not to show, and she swallowed her anger. "Fine," she said. "We rebuild." They spent the next 3 days repairing the barn. Clara helped where she could, holding boards while Ethan nailed them in place, fetching tools, bringing water and food. Miguel worked with grim determination, barely speaking. People from town rode out to see the damage. Some offered help. Others just stared and shook their heads, like they'd known this would happen eventually. Mrs. Chen brought supplies and stern words. "You need to be careful," she told Clara while the men worked. "Bishop and Dalton, they don't play fair, everyone knows it, but nobody talks about it because they own half the valley." "We didn't start this fight," Clara said. "Maybe not, but you're in it now." Mrs. Chen looked at her seriously. "You got grit, I'll give you that. But grit doesn't stop bullets or fires. You watch yourself." After she left, Clara stood there feeling the weight of it all. They were alone in this. Ethan, Miguel, and her against men with money and power and no conscience. The odds weren't good. But Clara had never had good odds. Her whole life had been one long exercise in making impossible situations work. This was just another impossible situation. She went back to work. By the end of the week, the barn was functional again. Not beautiful, but solid. Ethan paid Miguel extra for the overtime, money they could barely spare, but nobody complained. The following Sunday, Clara rode into town alone. Ethan had protested, but she'd been firm. She needed supplies, and she wasn't going to let fear of Bishop or Dalton keep her imprisoned on the ranch. If they won that battle, they'd already lost the war. Silver Ridge was quiet that morning. Most people were in church, which suited Clara fine. She made her rounds quickly. The general store, the feed supplier, the post office where a letter from her mother was waiting. She sat on a bench outside to read it, her stomach tight with anxiety. Her mother's handwriting was shaky, which meant she'd been upset when she wrote it. The letter was full of confusion and hurt. Thomas Wardell had indeed written to her, painting Clara as a scheming woman who'd manipulated her way into a marriage with Ethan Calloway. Her mother wanted to know if it was true, wanted to know if Clara was safe, wanted to know what had really happened. Clara felt guilt twist in her gut. She should have written sooner, should have told the truth before Wardell poisoned the well. She was still sitting there, trying to compose a response in her head, when a shadow fell across her. Mrs. Calloway. Clara looked up to find a woman standing there, tall, elegant, maybe 40, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to see right through her. "I'm sorry," Clara said. "Do I know you?" "No, but I know you." The woman sat down uninvited. I'm Margaret Trent. I own the hotel here in town. Clara had seen the hotel, a 3-story building that was by far the nicest structure in Silver Ridge. What can I do for you, Mrs. Trent? I wanted to meet the woman who had Frank Dalton so riled up he burned down a barn. Margaret's smile was sharp. That takes either courage or stupidity, and I wanted to see which one you had. Maybe both. Good answer. Margaret studied her appraisingly. You know, when I heard Ethan Calloway had gotten married, I was surprised. He's been alone out there for years, turning down every woman who showed interest. Then suddenly, he marries a mail-order bride who was supposed to marry Thomas Wardle. People talked. People always talk. True, but sometimes they're right to. Margaret leaned closer. I don't care whether your marriage is real or convenient or some combination of both. That's your business. What I care about is that you've done more in 2 months to stand up to Bishop and Dalton than anyone's managed in 10 years. Clara felt a flicker of hope. You don't like them either? I despise them. They've been strangling this town slowly, buying up property, controlling water, making sure nobody can succeed unless they allow it. Margaret's voice was hard. My husband tried to fight them. They ruined him, drove him to drink and then to an early grave. I survived because I was smart enough to stay neutral and wealthy enough that they couldn't touch me. I'm sorry. Don't be. Just don't make the same mistakes he did. Margaret pulled a card from her purse and pressed it into Clara's hand. If you need help, real help, not just sympathy, you come find me. I can't fight them openly, but I can work behind the scenes. And I owe my late husband at least that much. Clara looked at the card, then at Margaret. Why are you telling me this? Because you remind me of myself 20 years ago, full of fight and too stubborn to know when to quit. Margaret stood. Use that stubbornness wisely, Mrs. Calloway. And don't trust anyone in this town who claims they're staying neutral. Neutral is just another word for complicit. She walked away before Clara could respond. Clara sat there for a long moment, turning the card over in her hands. Then she tucked it carefully into her pocket and went to finish her errands. On the ride back to Redstone, she thought about Margaret's words, about her own mother's letter, about the choices she'd made and the ones still ahead of her. She'd come west looking for safety and ended up in the middle of a war. But if she was being honest with herself, she didn't entirely regret it. When Clara got back to the ranch, she found Ethan in the house instead of outside working. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a letter of his own, his face pale. What's wrong? She asked. He looked up like he'd forgotten she existed. I got a notice from the bank. Clara's heart dropped. We made the payment. Harrison said, it's not about a payment. It's about the loan terms. Ethan pushed the letter across the table. Bishop bought my note from the bank. Clara snatched up the paper and read it quickly. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was clear. Stuart Bishop had purchased Ethan's debt from the bank and was now the legal holder of the loan, which meant he could call it due whenever he wanted. Can he do this? Clara demanded. Apparently. But we've been making payments. We're current on everything. Doesn't matter. The bank had the right to sell the note. Harrison probably got a nice premium for it, too. Ethan's voice was hollow. Bishop owns us now. Clara sat down heavily. Her mind was racing through possibilities, all of them bad. When can he call it? She asked. Whenever he wants. Could be tomorrow. Could be 6 months from now. Ethan laughed bitterly. He'll probably wait until we've made more improvements, increase the property value, and then take it all. No. Clara's voice was sharp. We're not giving up. Clara, no. She stood, pacing. There has to be something we can do. We can find another lender, refinance through someone else. Who? Bishop and Dalton control every bank and investor within 200 miles. Nobody's going to go against them. Clara wanted to throw something, wanted to scream at the unfairness of it all. They'd done everything right, worked themselves half to death, made every payment, turned the ranch around. And it still wasn't enough. What about the water rights? She said suddenly. We own those outright. If we sell them, then we lose our only leverage. Ethan shook his head. The second we sell the water rights, Bishop calls the loan and takes the land anyway. We'd end up with nothing. So what do we do? I don't know. They sat in silence, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. Finally, Clara said, We keep going. We keep making payments. We keep improving the ranch. And we find a way to get out from under Bishop's control before he moves against us. And if we can't, Clara met his eyes, then we go down fighting, but we don't give up. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then some of the defeat left his face, replaced by something harder, more determined. All right, he said quietly. We fight. That night, Clara wrote 2 letters. The first was to her mother telling her the truth. That she hadn't married Thomas Wardell, that she'd found work with Ethan Calloway, and yes, they'd gotten married, but it was complicated and she'd explain more later. That she was safe and she was sorry for worrying everyone and she'd send money as soon as she could. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was closer than what she'd written before. The second letter was to an address Margaret Trent had written on the back of her card, a lawyer in Denver who, according to Margaret, wasn't afraid of Bishop or Dalton. Clara didn't know if anything would come of it, but she had to try. The response from Denver came 3 weeks later. The lawyer, a man named James Whitaker, was interested in their case. He'd heard of Bishop and Dalton's tactics and had been looking for someone willing to challenge them legally, but he was honest about their chances, slim at best, and it would cost money they didn't have. Clara wrote back anyway, outlining their situation in detail. The water rights, the bought loan, the intimidation tactics. Everything. If they were going to fight, they might as well fight smart. Meanwhile, life on the ranch continued. August brought more heat, more drought, more tension. The water rights agreements became even more valuable as neighboring ranches struggled. Clara negotiated higher prices for the fall season, knowing they needed every dollar they could get. Ethan grew quieter as the weeks passed. He worked longer hours, spoke less, and Clara could see the weight of everything crushing down on him. She tried to help, tried to shoulder more of the burden, but there was only so much she could do. One evening, she found him sitting on the porch long after dark, just staring out at nothing. She sat down beside him without speaking. I keep thinking about what my mother would say, Ethan said finally, about how I've handled all this. The fake marriage, the water rights, getting us into a war with Bishop and Dalton. You did what you had to do. Did I? Or did I just make everything worse? He looked at her. You could have had a quiet life somewhere. Maybe not with Wardell, but eventually someone decent would have come along. Instead, you're stuck here in the middle of this mess because I was too desperate to think straight. I chose to stay, Clara said firmly. Nobody forced me. I could have gotten back on that train. Could have found work somewhere else. I stayed because I wanted to. Why? The question was raw. Why would you want this? Clara was quiet for a moment, trying to find words for something she barely understood herself. Because for the first time in my life, I'm not just surviving, she said slowly. I'm building something. Even if it falls apart, even if we lose everything, I'll know I tried. I'll know I fought for something that mattered. She paused. That's worth more than safety. Ethan didn't say anything, but he reached over and took her hand. They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped in the darkness, neither of them speaking. It wasn't comfort, exactly, but it was solidarity. And right then, that was enough. The confrontation came on a Tuesday. Clara was in town picking up supplies when she saw a crowd gathered outside the saloon. She could hear shouting, angry voices, the sound of breaking glass. Against her better judgment, she moved closer. Frank Dalton was in the middle of the crowd, red-faced and furious, yelling at a young man Clara didn't recognize. The man was bleeding from his mouth, clearly on the losing end of whatever fight had started. You work for me, you follow my rules, Dalton roared. You don't get to decide when you're done. I fulfilled my contract, the young man shot back. I worked 6 months like we agreed. You can't keep me here. I can do whatever I want. You signed papers. Papers you changed after I signed them, Dalton hit him. The crowd gasped, but nobody moved to intervene. The young man went down hard, blood streaming from his nose. Clara felt rage ignite in her chest. She pushed through the crowd before she could think better of it. That's enough, she said loudly. Dalton turned, his expression shifting from rage to surprise when he saw her. Mrs. Calloway, this doesn't concern you. You're beating a man in the street. I'd say it concerns everyone. Clara knelt beside the young man, helping him sit up. You all right? He nodded shakily. This is between me and my employee, Dalton said, his voice dangerous. Walk away. He says he's not your employee anymore. He's wrong. Clara stood, positioning herself between Dalton and the injured man. Show me the contract. Excuse me? The papers he signed. Show me. If they prove he's still bound to you, then I'll leave. But if you change the terms like he says, then you're the one breaking the law. Dalton's face went purple. You got no right. I have every right to call out fraud when I see it. Clara's voice carried across the crowd. Or are you afraid to show those papers because you know they'll prove you're a cheat? The crowd had gone dead silent. Everyone was watching now, waiting to see what would happen. Dalton took a step toward Clara. She held her ground, though her heart was hammering so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. You're making a mistake, Dalton said softly. A big one. Then show me the contract and prove me wrong. For a moment, Clara thought he might hit her. She could see the calculation in his eyes, weighing the satisfaction of putting her in her place against the scandal of striking a woman in public. Then Sheriff Morrison pushed through the crowd. All right, that's enough excitement for one day, he said with false heartiness. Frank, let the boy go. He's not worth the trouble. Dalton didn't move, still staring at Clara. Frank, the sheriff repeated, let it go. Finally, Dalton stepped back. Fine, but you, he pointed at the young man, you're out of this valley by sundown, and you, he turned to Clara, you just made a very dangerous enemy. He walked away, the crowd parting for him like water. Clara helped the young man to his feet. You got somewhere to go? My cousin's place in Ridgecrest. I was trying to save enough to get there. Clara pulled money from her pocket. $5 she'd been planning to use for supplies. Here, get yourself on the next stage. I can't take it, and get out of this valley like he said. It's not safe for you here. The young man took the money with shaking hands. Thank you, ma'am. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. After he left, Mrs. Chen appeared at Clara's elbow. That was either the bravest or stupidest thing I've ever seen, she said quietly. Everyone keeps telling me that. Because it's true, Mrs. Chen looked worried. Dalton doesn't forget challenges, especially public ones. I know. Then why? Because someone had to, Clara said simply. Everyone here was just watching. Nobody was going to help that boy except me, Mrs. Chen sighed. You got a good heart, Clara. I just hope it doesn't get you killed. Clara made her purchases quickly and headed back to the ranch, her hands still shaking from adrenaline. She didn't tell Ethan what had happened. He had enough to worry about. But word traveled fast. 2 days later, Miguel came to the house looking grim. Señora, he said quietly, you should see this. He led her out to the north pasture where the spring was, or where the spring had been. Someone had dynamited it. The water that had flowed steady and clear for as long as anyone could remember was now just a muddy pit. The explosion had collapsed the underground source, redirecting the flow somewhere else. Maybe nowhere at all. Clara stood there, staring at the destruction, and felt something inside her break. The spring had been their lifeline, their bargaining chip, their only leverage against Bishop and Dalton, and now it was gone. When did this happen? She asked, her voice hollow. Last night. I heard the explosion, but by the time I got here, whoever did it was long gone. Miguel's face was hard. This was Dalton, has to be. Can we fix it? Maybe. But it would cost more than we have, and there's no guarantee we could even find the water source again. Clara walked back to the house in a daze. She found Ethan in the barn and told him what had happened. He didn't say anything, just stood there, his face carved from stone. This is my fault, Clara said. I challenged Dalton in town. He did this because of me. No. Ethan's voice was quiet but firm. He did this because he's a bastard who can't stand anyone standing up to him. This was always going to happen. You just gave him an excuse to do it sooner. What do we do now? Ethan looked at her, and Clara saw something she'd never seen before in his eyes. Defeat. I don't know, he said. I honestly don't know. That night was the longest of Clara's life. She sat at the kitchen table with the ledger spread out in front of her, running numbers that refused to add up to anything but disaster. Without the spring, they had no water rights to sell. Without the water rights income, they couldn't make next month's payment to Bishop. And once they missed a payment, he'd call the loan and take everything. 3 months of work, 3 months of fighting and scraping and refusing to quit. All of it gone because of one stick of dynamite. Clara put her head in her hands and let herself feel the weight of it. Not crying, she was too angry for tears, but just sitting there with the crushing realization that sometimes fighting back wasn't enough. You should sleep. She looked up to find Ethan in the doorway, still dressed, looking as exhausted as she felt. Can't, Clara said. I keep thinking there has to be something I'm missing. Some way to… There isn't. Ethan crossed to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot that had been sitting there since supper. He set one in front of Clara and took the chair across from her. I've been going over it in my head all evening. We're done. Don't say that. It's true. Bishop won. He waited until we'd used up all our resources fixing this place, making it valuable again, and then he destroyed the one thing that gave us any leverage. Ethan's voice was flat, emotionless. It's actually kind of brilliant, if you think about it. Ruthless, but brilliant. Clara wrapped her hands around the coffee cup, needing the warmth. What happens now? We default on the payment. Bishop calls the loan. We have maybe 30 days to clear out before he takes possession. Ethan stared into his coffee. I'll give you enough money to get back east. More than we agreed on. It's the least I can do after dragging you into this mess. Stop talking like it's over. Clara? No. She looked at him hard. I'm not giving up. Not yet. What else is there to try? I don't know, but we have 30 days to figure it out. Clara pulled the ledgers closer. Maybe we can sell the cattle, all of them, and make one big payment that buys us more time. And then what? We'd have no income and no way to rebuild the herd. We'd be in the same position 6 months from now, just with nothing left to sell. Then we find investors, someone who wants to see Bishop and Dalton taken down. We tried that. Nobody in this territory will go against them. You know that. Clara knew he was right, but admitting it felt like surrender, and she wasn't ready for that yet. They sat in silence for a while, drinking terrible coffee and avoiding each other's eyes. I'm sorry, Ethan said finally, for getting you into this, for making you think we had a chance when we never really did. You didn't make me think anything. I chose this. I knew the risks. Did you? He looked at her. Did you really know what you were signing up for when you agreed to this fake marriage? Because I'm not sure I did. Clara thought about that night on the platform in Silver Ridge, about how desperate and lost she'd felt, about the offer Ethan had made and the choice she'd made to accept it. No, she admitted. I didn't know, but I don't regret it. You should. Well, I don't. Clara set down her cup. These past 3 months have been the hardest of my life, but they've also been the first time I felt like I mattered, like what I did made a difference. Even if we lose everything tomorrow, at least I tried. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, softer. You know the worst part? He said. I was starting to think this could be real. Not the marriage on paper, but this. Us. Working together. Building something together. He laughed bitterly. Stupid, right? Clara's heart did something complicated in her chest. Not stupid. No? No. She met his eyes. I was thinking the same thing. The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and dangerous. Ethan reached across the table and took her hand. Not the business-like handshake they'd started with, but something slower, more deliberate. If things were different, he said quietly, if we weren't about to lose everything. But we are, Clara squeezed his hand, and we need to focus on that, on fighting this, not on whatever this is. He nodded, but he didn't let go of her hand. They sat like that until the coffee went cold, and the lamp burned low, and finally Clara couldn't keep her eyes open anymore. Get some sleep, Ethan said, releasing her hand. We'll figure out what to do in the morning. But morning brought worse news. Clara woke to the sound of horses and angry voices. She threw on a dress and rushed outside to find 3 men on horseback in front of the house. Ethan and Miguel were already there, Miguel holding a rifle. The man in front was wearing a badge. Sheriff Morrison, looking uncomfortable but determined. Ethan, he said, I need you to come with me. On what charge? Ethan's voice was hard. Destruction of property. Frank Dalton's claiming you dynamited his north fence line and killed 2 of his steers. Clara felt ice flood her veins. That's absurd. Ethan was here all night. Morrison didn't look at her. That's for a judge to decide. Right now I need to take him in for questioning. This is a setup, Ethan said flatly. Dalton did this. You know he did. What I know is I have a job to do. You can come peacefully or I can make it difficult. Morrison's hand rested on his gun. Your choice. Ethan looked at Miguel, then at Clara. She could see him weighing the options, none of them good. Fine, he said finally. I'll come. But this is bullshit, and everyone knows it. Watch your language in front of the lady, Morrison said, which would have been funny if it wasn't so infuriating. Clara watched them ride away, Ethan's hands tied to his saddle horn like a common criminal, and felt rage so pure it made her dizzy. This was Dalton's next move. Destroy their water source, then remove Ethan from the property, leaving Clara and Miguel vulnerable. She turned to Miguel. How long until they can legally hold him? Without charges? Maybe 48 hours. But if Dalton's got the judge in his pocket, could be longer. We need to get him out. Senora, we can't break him out of jail. That's crazy. I'm not talking about breaking him out. I'm talking about proving he's innocent. Clara's mind was already racing. Dalton claimed Ethan destroyed his fence last night. What time last night? The sheriff said around midnight. Ethan was here at midnight. We were both in the kitchen, going over the books. I can testify to that. Miguel shook his head. Your testimony won't mean anything. You're his wife. Of course you'd lie for him. Then we need someone else who can verify he was here. Someone without a stake in this. Clara thought hard. What about the damage to Dalton's property? Has anyone actually seen it? I don't know. Then we go look. If Dalton's lying about the extent of the damage, or if it doesn't look like something Ethan could have done, that's evidence. And if Dalton catches us on his property, then we're trespassing, which is still better than letting Ethan rot in jail for something he didn't do. Clara was already moving toward the barn. You coming? Miguel muttered something in Spanish that Clara didn't catch, but he followed her. They saddled 2 horses and rode north toward Dalton's property. Clara had only been this way once before, when Ethan was showing her the property boundaries. The land here was rougher, more rocky, with scrub brush and stunted trees. They found the damaged fence easily enough. Someone had made sure it was visible from the road. 2 sections of fence posts had been blown apart, and there were indeed 2 dead steers lying in the field beyond. Clara dismounted and walked closer, studying the scene. Something's wrong, she said. What? Look at the blast pattern. The fence posts are blown outward, away from Dalton's property. She pointed. If someone from our side had set the charges, the debris would be blown the other direction, toward his land, not away from it. Miguel crouched down, examining the splintered wood. You're right. This was set from inside Dalton's property, which means Dalton did this himself and blamed Ethan. Clara felt a grim satisfaction. We need to document this. Take measurements, make sketches. Anything that proves the explosion came from the wrong direction. They spent an hour collecting evidence, working quickly and glancing over their shoulders the whole time. Clara sketched the scene in a notebook, noting the position of debris, the angle of the damage, everything that might matter in front of a judge. They were almost finished when Miguel grabbed her arm. Someone's coming. Clara looked up and saw dust rising in the distance. Multiple riders. Go, Miguel said. Now. They mounted and rode hard back toward Redstone, not stopping until they were well clear of Dalton's property. Clara's hands were shaking from adrenaline, but she had what she needed. Proof. Maybe. She rode straight to Silver Ridge and went directly to Margaret Trent's hotel. The elegant woman was in her office, reviewing ledgers. She looked up when Clara burst in, disheveled and desperate. Mrs. Calloway, you look like you've had a difficult morning. They arrested Ethan on false charges. Dalton's claiming he destroyed property, but I have evidence that proves it's a lie. Clara pulled out her notebook. I need help. Someone who knows the law who can present this to a judge. Slow down. Margaret stood and guided Clara to a chair. Start from the beginning. Clara explained everything. The destroyed spring, Ethan's arrest, the evidence she and Miguel had gathered. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression growing more thoughtful with each detail. When Clara finished, Margaret was quiet for a moment. This is good, she said finally, tapping the notebook. The blast pattern evidence could work, but you need more than sketches. You need testimony from someone with credentials, an expert. Where do I find an expert on explosives in Silver Ridge? You don't, but there's a mining engineer in Ridgecrest who owes me a favor. If I can get him here to examine the site and testify, it would carry weight with Judge Palmer. Palmer's the judge? I thought he was in Dalton's pocket. He is, but he's also vain. He likes to think of himself as fair and impartial, even when he's not. If we present strong enough evidence in a public hearing, he'll have no choice but to dismiss the charges. Otherwise, he looks corrupt, and Palmer hates looking bad. Clara felt hope flicker. Can you really get this engineer here? I can try. But Clara, you need to understand something. Margaret's voice was serious. Even if we get Ethan released, this doesn't solve your real problem. Dalton's not going to stop. He'll just find another angle. I know, but one problem at a time. Margaret studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, I'll send for the engineer. In the meantime, you need to stay visible. Go about your business like you're not worried. Show Dalton he hasn't broken you. That'll be the easiest acting job I've ever had. Margaret almost smiled. I'm starting to understand why my late husband liked lost causes. They're more interesting than safe bets. Clara spent the next 2 days in a state of controlled panic. She maintained the ranch with Miguel's help, kept up appearances in town, and tried not to think about Ethan sitting in a cell. The lawyer from Denver, James Whitaker, had sent another letter saying he was working on their case but needed more time. Time they didn't have. The mining engineer arrived on the 3rd day. His name was Robert Chen, Mrs. Chen's nephew, as it turned out, and he had credentials from 2 different universities back east. Margaret brought him to Redstone, and Clara led him to the destroyed spring first, then to Dalton's property to examine the fence damage. Chen took measurements, made notes, and spent an hour examining blast patterns and debris scatter. When he finished, his expression was grim. "This is sloppy work," he said. Whoever set these charges wasn't trying to hide what they were doing. They wanted it to look like amateur sabotage. So it was deliberate, Clara asked. Absolutely. And the blast pattern on Mr. Dalton's fence definitely originated from inside his property, not outside. Anyone with basic knowledge of explosives could see that. Will you testify to that? Chen hesitated. You understand what you're asking. If I testify against Dalton, I'll be making an enemy of the most powerful man in this valley. I understand, and I'm asking anyway. He looked at her for a long moment, then at Margaret. She reminds me of you, he said to his aunt. Stubborn and probably going to get herself killed. I know, Mrs. Chen said. That's why we're helping her. Chen sighed. Fine, I'll testify. But I want it on record that I think this is a terrible idea. The hearing was set for the following morning. Clara dressed carefully in her best dress, the same navy cotton she'd worn the day she arrived in Silver Ridge, mended and cleaned until it looked almost respectable. She braided her hair, pinned it up, and stared at herself in the mirror. She looked tired, scared, but also determined. That would have to be enough. Miguel drove her to town in the wagon. The courthouse was already crowded when they arrived. Apparently word of the hearing had spread, and people were curious to see Ethan Calloway's wife fight for him. Sheriff Morrison led Ethan in wearing handcuffs. He looked thinner after 3 days in jail, but his eyes found Clara's immediately, and she saw relief there. The hearing began promptly at 9. Judge Palmer was exactly what Clara had expected, a portly man in his 60s with a pompous manner and a thinning hairline. He sat behind the bench like a king on a throne. Dalton's lawyer spoke first, laying out the charges. Destruction of property, trespassing, killing livestock. He painted Ethan as a desperate man, lashing out at a successful neighbor. Your Honor, the lawyer concluded, Mr. Calloway has motive and opportunity. His ranch is failing, he's in debt to my client, and he's clearly acting out of jealousy and desperation. Clara gritted her teeth through the whole speech. Then it was their turn. Margaret had helped Clara find a lawyer willing to take the case, a young man named David Porter who looked barely old enough to shave, but had a sharp mind and no fear of Dalton. Porter called Robert Chen as his first witness. The mining engineer explained his credentials, described his examination of both sites, and provided technical testimony about blast patterns and debris scatter that made the judge's eyes glaze over. In your professional opinion, Porter asked, could the damage to Mr. Dalton's fence have been caused by someone operating from outside his property? No. The blast originated from inside the fence line. The debris pattern is conclusive. So someone on Mr. Dalton's property set those charges? That's correct. Dalton's lawyer objected, calling the testimony speculative, but Palmer overruled him. Clara could see the judge wasn't happy. He clearly wanted to fine for Dalton, but the evidence was too strong to ignore. Porter called Clara next. She walked to the witness stand, feeling every eye in the courtroom on her. Her hands were shaking, but she kept them folded in her lap where no one could see. Porter asked her to describe the night in question. Clara testified that Ethan had been home all evening, that they'd been working on the ranch accounts together until well past midnight, and that he'd never left the property. Dalton's lawyer cross-examined her aggressively. "Mrs. Calloway, isn't it true that you married your husband under somewhat unusual circumstances?" "I'm not sure what you mean." "You were engaged to another man, Thomas Wardell. You arrived in Silver Ridge to marry him, and within days you'd married Ethan Calloway instead. Some might find that suspicious." Clara felt heat rise in her face. "Mr. Wardell decided he didn't want to marry me. Mr. Calloway offered me employment, and yes, we eventually married. I don't see what that has to do with—" "It speaks to your character, Mrs. Calloway, and to your willingness to bend the truth when it suits you." "Objection," Porter said. "Relevance? I'm establishing that the witness has a history of deception." Palmer allowed it, and Clara had to sit there while Dalton's lawyer tore apart her credibility. By the time he finished, she felt stripped bare in front of the whole town. But she'd held her ground, hadn't broken, hadn't given him anything he could use. Porter called one more witness, Miguel, who testified that he'd checked on Ethan multiple times that night and could confirm he never left the ranch. Dalton's lawyer tried to discredit him too, implying he was lying to protect his employer, but Miguel's calm, straightforward testimony was hard to shake. Finally, Palmer called for closing arguments. Dalton's lawyer made one last attempt to paint Ethan as guilty, but it was weak. The evidence didn't support his narrative. Porter's closing was simple and direct. The blast patterns proved the charges were false. Multiple witnesses placed Ethan at his ranch when the alleged crime occurred. This was clearly an attempt by Mr. Dalton to remove a business rival under false pretenses. Palmer took exactly 10 minutes to deliberate. "I find insufficient evidence to hold Mr. Calloway on these charges," he announced. "The defendant is free to go. Case dismissed." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Clara felt dizzy with relief. Ethan was released immediately, his handcuffs removed. He crossed the courtroom to Clara, and for a moment they just stood there, neither sure what to say. Then Clara did something she'd never done before. She hugged him. It was brief, awkward, and completely improper in front of the entire town, but she didn't care. "You did it," Ethan said quietly. "You got me out. We did it, all of us." They left the courthouse together, stepping into the afternoon sun. People were staring, whispering, but Clara ignored them. Frank Dalton was waiting by his horse across the street. He looked at them with pure hatred. "This isn't over," he called out. "You hear me, Calloway? This isn't over." Ethan didn't respond, just put his hand on Clara's back and guided her toward their wagon. But Clara looked back once. Dalton was still standing there, watching them with the cold calculation of a man planning his next move. The ride back to Redstone was quiet. Ethan sat beside Clara on the wagon bench, and she could feel the tension radiating off him. The relief of being free was already fading, replaced by the grim knowledge that they'd won a battle, but the war was far from over. "Thank you," he said finally, "for everything you did. The evidence, the testimony, hiring Porter. Margaret helped with most of it, and Mrs. Chen got her nephew to come. I just connected the pieces." "You did more than that." Ethan looked at her. "You fought for me when you had no reason to, when it would have been easier to just walk away." "I had plenty of reasons." "Name one." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because somewhere along the way this stopped being a business arrangement, and I don't abandon my—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Your what?" Ethan asked softly. Clara met his eyes. "My partner." Something passed between them then, something that had been building for months, but neither of them had been willing to name. "Clara, don't." She looked away. "We can't. Not with everything else that's happening. We need to stay focused." "On what?" "We're still going to lose the ranch. Destroying Dalton's case doesn't change that." "Then we find another way to fight." "With what?" "We're out of options, out of time, out of everything." Clara wanted to argue, but she couldn't. He was right. They'd survive today, but tomorrow the loan would still be due, and Bishop would still be waiting to take everything. Unless... An idea hit her, so crazy it might actually work. "What if we sue Bishop?" she said suddenly. Ethan looked at her like she'd lost her mind. Sue him for what? For fraud. For buying the loan under false pretenses, for working with Dalton to harass us and destroy our property. We have evidence now. Chen's testimony proves Dalton sabotaged his own fence to frame you. If we can connect that to Bishop, it'll take months, maybe years. We don't have that kind of time. But if we file the suit, it creates a legal complication. Bishop can't call the loan while we're actively suing him over it. It would look like retaliation. Clara's mind was racing. Whitaker said he wanted to take on Bishop and Dalton. This gives him the ammunition to do it. Ethan was quiet, thinking it through. It's a delay tactic, he said finally, not a solution. I know, but delays buy time. And time gives us a chance to find a real solution. Or it just postpones the inevitable. Maybe. Clara looked at him. But I'd rather go down fighting than surrender now, wouldn't you? Ethan studied her face for a long moment, then slowly he nodded. All right, he said, we file the suit. But Clara, if this doesn't work, if we lose anyway, then we lose. But at least we'll know we tried everything. They reached the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the mountains gold and red. Miguel was waiting on the porch, his face breaking into a rare smile when he saw Ethan. Welcome home, boss. Good to be home. Ethan climbed down from the wagon. Thanks for holding down the fort. Senora did most of the work. I just made sure nobody burned the place down. That night, they sat around the kitchen table and Clara explained her plan. Miguel listened carefully, asking pointed questions. When she finished, he sat back and crossed his arms. This is loco, he said, but it might work. That seems to be the theme lately, Ethan said dryly. Clara pulled out paper and started drafting a letter to Whitaker. She outlined everything: the destroyed spring, the false arrest, Chen's testimony, the timeline of Dalton and Bishop's harassment. She laid out the case for fraud and conspiracy and asked him to file suit immediately. She sealed the letter and set it aside to mail first thing in the morning. What now? Ethan asked. Now we wait, Clara said, and we keep working, keep improving the ranch, keep making payments, keep showing Bishop and Dalton that we're not going anywhere. And when they come at us again, then we deal with it, together. Miguel stood, stretching. I'm going to check on the horses. You two should get some rest. You look like hell. After he left, Ethan and Clara sat in silence for a while. I keep thinking about what you said, Ethan said finally, about this not being a business arrangement anymore. Clara's heart sped up. Ethan, I know we can't, not with everything else happening, but when this is over, when we either win or lose, I want... He stopped, struggling for words. I want this to be real. The marriage. Us. All of it. Clara felt something crack open in her chest. Even if we lose the ranch? She asked quietly. Even then, it's not about the ranch anymore. It's about you. She should have said no, should have kept the distance between them that had kept things simple and safe. But she was tired of being safe, tired of holding back. Okay, she said, when this is over, we'll figure out what real looks like. Ethan reached across the table and took her hand, and this time, neither of them let go. The letter went out the next morning, and then came the hardest part, waiting. Clara threw herself into the work with renewed intensity, as if staying busy could somehow control the future. She reorganized the entire household, repaired every piece of clothing that needed mending, and turned the vegetable garden into something that actually produced food, instead of just existing. Ethan and Miguel worked the cattle and repaired fences, preparing for winter that would come whether they were still there to see it or not. 3 weeks passed with no word from Whitaker, then 4. Clara started to wonder if the letter had even reached him, or if he'd read it and decided their case was hopeless after all. The answer came on a Tuesday afternoon when a stranger rode up to the ranch in a suit that looked wildly out of place against the dusty landscape. He was tall, maybe 50, with sharp eyes and the kind of confidence that came from winning more fights than he'd lost. "Mrs. Calloway," he called out as Clara emerged from the house. "I'm James Whitaker." Clara's heart jumped. "You came." "I did. Is your husband available?" Ethan appeared from the barn, wiping grease from his hands. When he saw Whitaker, his expression shifted from caution to something like hope. They gathered in the kitchen, the three of them, while Whitaker spread papers across the table. "I've been investigating your case," he said without preamble. And I found some interesting things. Stuart Bishop's acquisition of your loan wasn't entirely legal. What do you mean? Ethan asked. The bank was required to notify you before selling the note to a third party. They never did, which means the transfer might be voidable. Whitaker pulled out a document. More importantly, I've been digging into Bishop and Dalton's business dealings. They've been doing the same routine for years. Identify struggling ranches, buy up their debts, harass them into default, then acquire the property for pennies on the dollar. But they've gotten sloppy. I found 3 other ranchers willing to testify about similar tactics. Clara leaned forward. So we can prove a pattern. Exactly. It's not just harassment, it's conspiracy to defraud. And if we can prove that in court, everything they've taken could be challenged. How long would that take? Ethan's voice was careful, like he was afraid to hope too hard. Months? Maybe a year? But here's where it gets interesting. Whitaker smiled, and it wasn't a friendly expression. I've already filed preliminary motions. Bishop can't call your loan while the case is pending without it looking like retaliation, which means you've got breathing room. How much breathing room? Clara asked. Enough to actually fix your water situation and get back on solid financial ground. If you can prove the ranch is viable and you're making payments in good faith, even if we lose the lawsuit, you'll be in a much stronger negotiating position. Ethan looked at Clara, and she could see the same thought occurring to both of them. This was a chance. A real one. There's one more thing, Whitaker said. I need to be honest with you. This fight is going to get ugly. Bishop and Dalton have deep pockets and a lot of people in their corner. They're going to come at you with everything they have. Are you prepared for that? Clara thought about the barn fire, the destroyed spring, Ethan in handcuffs, about every humiliation and setback they'd already endured. We're prepared, she said. Whitaker nodded. Good, because they're going to make you prove it. He stayed for 2 more hours going over strategy and documentation. When he finally left, Clara and Ethan sat in stunned silence. We have a chance, Ethan said, like he couldn't quite believe it. A fighting chance, Clara corrected, which is more than we had yesterday. That night they celebrated quietly, just the 3 of them, sharing a bottle of whiskey Miguel had been saving for a special occasion. They didn't get drunk, but they let themselves relax for the first time in months, talking about the future like it might actually exist. The retaliation came faster than Whitaker had predicted. 2 days later, cattle started disappearing. Not the whole herd, just enough to hurt. 3 had one night, 4 the next. Miguel found tracks leading toward Dalton's property, but by the time they could investigate, any evidence had been erased. Then the harassment escalated. Someone poisoned the well they'd been using since the spring was destroyed. Miguel caught them pumping water from the creek 3 miles away just to keep the remaining cattle alive. Fences were cut almost nightly. Equipment broke in suspicious ways. Clara started carrying a rifle everywhere, even just to walk to the henhouse. Ethan slept in the barn most nights, keeping watch. Miguel barely slept at all. The strain was crushing, but they held on. Clara used the breathing room Whitaker had bought them to reach out to other ranchers who'd been hurt by Bishop and Dalton. She wrote letters, made visits, slowly built a network of people who'd been too afraid to speak up individually, but might be willing to stand together. It was exhausting work, and most people said no. But a few said yes, and a few was more than they'd had before. October brought the first real cold snap, and with it, a letter from Clara's mother. Clara opened it with trembling hands, expecting recrimination or demands for explanation. Instead, she found something unexpected: understanding. Her mother wrote that Thomas Wardell had indeed contacted her, but his version of events had been so petty and vindictive that it had made her suspicious. So she'd written to the postmaster in Silver Ridge and then to Mrs. Chen, and slowly pieced together what had actually happened. She wasn't happy about the deception, the letter made that clear, but she understood why Clara had done it, and more importantly, she trusted Clara to know what was best for her own life. The letter ended with something that made Clara's throat tight. I raised you to be practical, but I think I forgot to teach you that it's okay to want more than just survival. If this man makes you happy, if this life is what you truly want, then you have my blessing, even if it's messy and complicated and nothing like what we planned. Be brave, my darling, and be happy. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Clara read the letter 3 times, then tucked it carefully into the box where she kept her most precious things. That evening, she showed it to Ethan. He read it silently, then handed it back. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She is, even when I don't want to admit it. What are you going to tell her? About us, I mean. About whether this is real or just, it's real, Clara interrupted. Maybe it started as something else, but it's real now, isn't it? Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed the kitchen and kissed her. It wasn't their first kiss. There had been a few stolen moments over the past weeks, brief and desperate, but this was different. Slower. More deliberate. A statement rather than a question. When they broke apart, Clara was breathless. I'm going to take that as a yes, she said. That's a yes, Ethan confirmed. They stood there in the kitchen, foreheads pressed together, while the lamp burned low, and outside the world kept trying to tear them apart. But inside, in this moment, they were solid. The town's annual harvest celebration fell on the first Saturday of November. It was Silver Ridge's biggest event. A whole day of competitions and music and dancing, everyone coming together before winter locked them all away. Clara had been dreading it, knowing that showing up meant facing the whole town's judgment, but Ethan had insisted. We're not hiding, he'd said. We're not giving them the satisfaction of thinking they've broken us. So Clara put on her best dress, the one Mrs. Chen had helped her make from fabric they could barely afford, and let Ethan help her into the wagon. The town square was packed when they arrived. Tables full of food, musicians tuning instruments, children running wild between the adults. It should have felt festive, but Clara could feel the tension in the air. People were watching them. Thomas Wardell was there, standing near the beer tent with a blonde woman on his arm. When he saw Clara, something ugly crossed his face. Ignore him, Ethan murmured. I intend to. They made their way through the crowd, stopping to talk to the few people who were friendly. Mrs. Chen and her family, Margaret Trent, a handful of ranchers who'd agreed to testify for Whitaker. But most people kept their distance, uncertain which side to take in a fight that was becoming increasingly public. Clara was sampling Mrs. Chen's dumplings when she heard raised voices. She turned to see Frank Dalton pushing through the crowd, his face red with anger or drink or both. He was heading straight for them. Calloway, he bellowed, you got some nerve showing your face here. The crowd went silent. Everyone turned to watch. Ethan stood slowly, positioning himself between Dalton and Clara. Frank, you're drunk. I'm clear-headed enough to know a cheat when I see one. You and your lawyer, trying to paint me as the bad guy when all I've done is try to collect on legitimate debts. Legitimate debts you bought specifically to drive us out. Dalton's eyes were mean. You can't prove that. Actually, we can. Clara stepped around Ethan before he could stop her. We have testimony from 4 other ranchers you did the exact same thing to. We have evidence of property destruction. We have... You have nothing, Dalton interrupted. You're a jumped-up mail-order bride playing at being a rancher. You don't belong here and everyone knows it. The crowd murmured. Clara felt humiliation wash over her, but she held her ground. You're right, she said clearly. I don't belong here. I wasn't born here. I don't have deep roots or family connections. I'm just a woman who was rejected by one man and took a chance on another. She paused. But I've worked this land for 6 months now. I've bled for it, fought for it, nearly lost everything for it. So maybe I don't belong here by your definition, but I've earned my place anyway. You've earned nothing, Dalton snarled. You're playing house with a man who's going to lose his ranch, and when he does, you'll move on to the next fool willing to take you in. That's enough, Ethan said, his voice dangerous. But Clara put a hand on his arm. No, let him talk. Let everyone hear what kind of man Frank Dalton really is. Dalton took a step closer. You want to know what kind of man I am? I'm the kind who built something in this valley, who turned dust into prosperity, who created jobs and opportunities while your husband was running his mother's ranch into the ground. You're the kind of man who destroys what he can't control, Clara shot back, who burns barns and poisons wells and frames innocent people for crimes they didn't commit. You're the kind of man who has to tear others down because you can't stand the thought of anyone succeeding without your permission. The crowd was riveted now, hanging on every word. Dalton's face went purple. You watch your mouth. Or what? You'll have me arrested on false charges too? You'll burn my house down? He hit her. Or tried to. Ethan's fist connected with Dalton's jaw before the older man's hand could reach Clara's face. The sound of impact was sharp and brutal, and Dalton went down hard. The crowd gasped. For a moment, nobody moved. Dalton lay sprawled in the dirt, blood trickling from his split lip, while Ethan stood over him with his fists still clenched. Then Sheriff Morrison was pushing through the crowd. "That's assault," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "He was defending his wife," Margaret Trent called out. "We all saw Dalton take a swing first." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. People who'd stayed neutral suddenly finding their voices. Morrison looked around at the assembled faces, clearly calculating which side would cause him less trouble. Finally, he sighed, "Frank, you're drunk. Go home and sleep it off." Dalton struggled to his feet, wiping blood from his mouth. "This isn't over," he said, glaring at Ethan and Clara. "You think you've won something here, but you haven't. I'll bury you both." "Get in line," Clara said coldly. Dalton stalked off, and slowly the crowd dispersed, returning to their celebrations with excited chatter about what they'd just witnessed. But one person hadn't moved. Thomas Wardell stood at the edge of the crowd, staring at Clara with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he started walking toward them. Clara tensed, but Ethan's hand found hers and squeezed. "Mrs. Calloway," Wardell said when he reached them. His voice was stiff, formal. "Mr. Calloway?" "What do you want, Thomas?" Ethan asked. Wardell looked uncomfortable, like the words he needed to say were stuck somewhere painful. "I wanted to apologize, to both of you, but especially to you, Clara." Clara blinked. Of all the things she'd expected, this wasn't one of them. "I was cruel," Wardell continued. "The way I treated you when you arrived, the things I said, it was inexcusable. I convinced myself you weren't what I wanted, but the truth is I was afraid. Afraid of a woman with opinions and backbone who wouldn't just decorate my life." He glanced at Ethan. "You're a better man than me, Calloway. You saw what I was too stupid to see." Ethan's grip on Clara's hand tightened. "I saw a woman who deserved better than being judged in 30 seconds. "Yes. Well." Wardell looked back at Clara. "I wrote to your mother because I was petty and hurt. That was wrong. I've written to her again, correcting the record, telling her the truth, that you married a good man and I have no claim on you or your choices." He paused. "I hope you can forgive me. Eventually." Clara studied his face, looking for insincerity and finding only genuine regret. "I forgive you," she said quietly. "Not because you deserve it, but because I'm tired of carrying anger around." Wardell nodded once, then turned and walked away. Clara watched him go, feeling something unknot in her chest. She'd spent months defined by his rejection, by the humiliation of being found wanting. But standing here now, with Ethan's hand in hers and the town's eyes on her, she realized she didn't care anymore what Thomas Wardell thought of her. She'd proven herself where it mattered. "You okay?" Ethan asked softly. "Yeah, I am." Clara looked up at him. "Dance with me." "What?" "The musicians are starting up. Dance with me, right here in front of everyone." Ethan smiled and it transformed his whole face. "All right." They danced there in the town square while people watched and whispered, and slowly, gradually, some of them started to smile. It wasn't acceptance exactly, but it was a start. And sometimes a start is enough. The lawsuit moved forward through the fall and into winter, a grinding, bureaucratic process that tested everyone's patience. Whitaker was relentless, building their case piece by piece, deposition by deposition. Bishop and Dalton threw lawyers and money at the problem, trying to bury them in paperwork, but Whitaker had been in worse fights and won. The spring water proved to be the key. Whitaker found a geologist willing to testify that the dynamite blast had been deliberately placed to cause maximum damage, not to just destroy the spring, but to potentially redirect it. And with some excavation work that Ethan and Miguel did through the brutal cold of December, they found it. The spring hadn't been destroyed after all, just diverted underground. With proper engineering, it could be recovered. The cost would be substantial, but Margaret Trent quietly arranged a loan from a bank in Denver that had no connection to Bishop or Dalton. It was a risk, more debt when they were already drowning, but it was also hope. By January, they had the spring flowing again. By February, the lawsuit was ready for trial. The trial lasted 3 weeks and became the biggest news the valley had seen in years. Ranchers testified about intimidation tactics. The mining engineer presented his evidence about the deliberate sabotage. Whitaker connected dots between property acquisitions and convenient accidents that had plagued previous owners. Bishop and Dalton's lawyers fought hard, but the weight of evidence was crushing. On a cold Monday in early March, the judge delivered his verdict. Clara and Ethan sat in the courtroom, hands clasped tight, while Judge Palmer read through pages of findings. Fraud, conspiracy, illegal acquisition of debts, the systematic targeting of vulnerable ranchers for financial gain. The verdict? Bishop and Dalton were ordered to return illegally acquired properties, pay damages, and faced criminal investigation for their actions. More specifically, Ethan's loan was voided. Redstone Ranch was free and clear. Clara felt Ethan's hand tighten around hers so hard it hurt. She looked at him and saw tears streaming down his face, the first time she'd ever seen him cry. They walked out of that courtroom into bright spring sunshine, and the small crowd that had gathered outside erupted in cheers. Other ranchers who'd testified, who'd found their courage, celebrating a victory that belonged to all of them. Mrs. Chen was there beaming. Margaret Trent gave Clara a nod of satisfaction. Even Sheriff Morrison looked relieved, like he was glad to be free of Bishop's thumb. "You did it," Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion. "You saved the ranch." "We did it," Clara corrected. "All of us." But she knew the truth. The ranch had been saved by community, by people who'd finally found the courage to stand together instead of being picked off one by one. That was the real victory. Not defeating Bishop and Dalton, but proving that they could be defeated. That night, back at Redstone, they had a celebration that would have made Ethan's mother proud. Mrs. Chen brought food. Margaret brought wine. Half a dozen ranchers showed up with their families, filling the house with noise and laughter and life. Miguel got drunk for the first time Clara had ever seen, and told stories about Ethan as a boy that made everyone howl. Ethan retaliated with stories about Miguel's supposed romantic adventures that were probably half lies but fully entertaining. And Clara stood in the kitchen she'd cleaned and restored, watching the people who'd become her community, feeling something she'd almost forgotten. Home. This was home. Not because of the land or the house, but because of the people in it and the life they'd built together. The party wound down around midnight, families heading home through the cold darkness. Claire started cleaning up, but Ethan stopped her. "Leave it," he said. "It'll still be there tomorrow." They walked outside together, standing on the porch and looking out at the ranch that was finally, truly theirs. "I keep thinking I should feel different," Ethan said. "Like winning should feel bigger somehow. But mostly I just feel tired." "That's because winning isn't the end," Clara said. "It's just permission to keep going." Wise words. I have my moments. They were quiet for a while, breathing in the cold air and watching stars wheel overhead. "There's something I need to ask you," Ethan said finally. Clara's heart sped up. "Okay. This marriage, we did it for practical reasons, to save the ranch and give you protection. But the ranch is saved now. You don't need protection anymore. You could leave if you wanted to, go back east, start fresh somewhere, be free of all this." "Is that what you want?" Claire's voice was careful. "For me to leave?" "No." The word was immediate and fierce. "But I need to know you're staying because you want to, not because you feel obligated." Clara turned to face him fully. "Ethan Calloway, I crossed half a country to marry a stranger, got rejected on a train platform, and ended up on your porch with nothing but a suitcase and stubbornness. Every day since then, I could have left. Could have gone back, found something easier, chosen safety over this mess." She took his hands. "I stayed because this mess is mine. Because you're mine. Because somewhere between cleaning your disaster of a kitchen and threatening Frank Dalton in public, I fell in love with you." Ethan pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "I fell in love with you the night you stood in my kitchen covered in grease and determined to fix everything. I just didn't know what to do about it. And now? Now I want to marry you, really marry you, not a courthouse signature or a business arrangement. A real wedding with real vows and everyone knowing this is forever." Clara laughed, the sound bright in the cold air. "We're already married. Then we'll get married again. Do it right this time." "All right, but I'm not wearing white. Everyone knows that ship has sailed." "Wear whatever you want, just say yes." "Yes." They kissed there on the porch while the ranch slept around them. Two people who'd built something real out of desperation and determination and the stubborn refusal to give up. The wedding happened in June, when the valley was green and the spring ran clear. It was simple, just friends and neighbors gathered at Redstone, Miguel officiating with a mixture of solemnity and barely suppressed amusement. Mrs. Chen made enough food to feed half the territory. Margaret gave Clara away since her mother's health prevented the journey west. Clara wore blue, a dress she'd made herself, practical and beautiful in equal measure. Ethan wore his best suit and looked terrified and happy and completely overwhelmed. When Miguel pronounced them husband and wife, really truly this time, the crowd cheered. And when Ethan kissed her, Clara felt something settle into place. Not perfect, because life was never perfect, but right. The ranch flourished over the next years. With the spring restored and the threat of Bishop and Dalton gone, other ranchers felt brave enough to succeed too. The valley became known for cooperation instead of cutthroat competition. Water-sharing agreements, collective bargaining for supplies, neighbors helping neighbors instead of tearing each other down. Clara became something of a legend, the woman who'd stood up to the valley's tyrants and won. People came to her for advice on business, on negotiations, on how to fight when fighting seemed hopeless. She helped where she could, always remembering what it felt like to be powerless and alone. Miguel stayed on, becoming family in all the ways that mattered. He taught Ethan's and Clara's daughter, born 2 years after the wedding, how to ride before she could properly walk. He told her stories about her grandmother, keeping that memory alive. Thomas Wardell eventually married his blonde companion and ran his mercantile with moderate success. He and Ethan would never be friends, but they managed civil nodding when they passed in town. Clara suspected that was about as good as it would get, and she was fine with that. Some wounds heal better with distance. Bishop and Dalton faced criminal charges that dragged through the courts for years. Bishop died before seeing the inside of a cell, but Dalton lived long enough to lose everything he'd built on other people's suffering. Clara tried to feel satisfaction in his downfall, but mostly just felt tired. Revenge, it turned out, was less sweet than simply outlasting your enemies. On a warm evening, 10 years after Clara had stepped off that train in Silver Ridge, she sat on the porch with Ethan, while their daughter chased fireflies in the yard. Miguel was inside making dinner, grumbling about something in Spanish that probably involved Ethan's ability to properly season meat. "You ever think about how different things could have been?" Ethan asked. "If Wardell had actually married you, if I hadn't offered you that job." "Sometimes," Claire admitted, "but not as often as I used to. After a while, the life you didn't live stops mattering as much as the one you did." "That's very philosophical." "I contain multitudes," Clara smiled. "Besides, I like this life, even with all the hard parts. Even with the constant work and the never-ending repairs and Miguel's cooking. Especially those things. They mean we're still here, still fighting, still building." Their daughter ran up to the porch, breathless and laughing, holding a jar with 3 captured fireflies. "Look what I got!" "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Clara said. "But you have to let them go before bed. They need to get home to their families." "Like you came home to Papa?" Clara and Ethan exchanged a glance. "Something like that," Clara said, though it was a bit more complicated. "Mama says everything with grown-ups is complicated," the girl said wisely. "Your mama is very smart." The girl released the fireflies and watched them drift away into the dusk, tiny lights disappearing into darkness. Then she ran back inside to see what Miguel was making, her voice carrying through the open door, demanding to help. "She's going to be a handful," Ethan observed. "She comes by it honestly." They sat in comfortable silence while the stars emerged and the night settled around them. Inside, Miguel and their daughter were arguing cheerfully about whether you could put too much garlic in anything. The house glowed with lamplight and warmth and the particular chaos of a family that had chosen each other. "You know what I think?" Clara said eventually. "What's that?" "I think rejection was the best thing that ever happened to me. Not because it didn't hurt, it did, but because it forced me to make my own choices instead of following someone else's plan. It made me fight for something instead of just accepting what I was given." Ethan took her hand. "You would have been fine either way. You're too stubborn to be anything else. Maybe. But I wouldn't have been happy. Wouldn't have been this." She gestured at the ranch, the house, the life they'd built. "Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is actually the door opening to everything you needed. You really do contain multitudes." Clara laughed and leaned against him, watching the mountains fade into darkness while inside their daughter's voice rose in triumph. Apparently, she'd won the garlic argument. This wasn't the life she'd planned when she'd boarded that train all those years ago. It was harder, messier, more complicated than anything she'd imagined. But it was also fuller, richer, more completely hers. And in the end, that was worth more than any safe, expected, approved of life could ever be. Sometimes you have to lose the future you wanted to find the one you needed. Sometimes rejection is redirection. And sometimes the person who turns you away is actually pushing you toward exactly where you were meant to be all along. Clara had learned that the hard way, through fire and loss and the kind of fighting that leaves scars. But she'd learned it, and she'd teach it to her daughter, who would face her own rejections and redirections someday. The difference was, her daughter would know something Clara hadn't known on that platform in Silver Ridge, that your worth isn't determined by who wants you. It's determined by what you do when nobody does, by how you build when everything's broken, by who you choose to become when all your plans fall apart. Clara Calloway, formerly Whitmore, briefly almost Wardell, had built herself into someone who didn't need permission to exist, who didn't need approval to matter, who took rejection and transformed it into the foundation of something unshakable. And every morning when she woke up in that ranch house, in the life she'd fought for, beside the man she'd chosen, and who'd chosen her back, she knew with absolute certainty that she'd ended up exactly where she belonged. Not because it was easy, but because it was real.